listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault lines.
Live from across the divided states of America, it is time now for another edition of the most disruptive show, covering news, politics, and events from across these disunited states we call America and the increasingly divided surface of our globe. In the independent corner, I'm your political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
And in the left corner, I am the indefatigable, a burning ember in the darkness, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And together that means you're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Good morning, everybody. It is August 18th, about 7 a.m. Eastern. Got headlines here. Let's get into COVID headlines first. We've got about 144,000 new COVID cases reported in the United States yesterday. Also just under 1,000 new deaths, 993 new deaths. Over the past week, there have been an average of about 139,872 cases per day. That's an increase of 52% from the average 2 weeks earlier. 51% of the total American public has been fully vaccinated, and 60% of residents have received at least one dose of a COVID vaccine. As of this morning, the coronavirus has infected about 37,133,000 people across the United States and has killed 623,237 people. Newsweek is reporting the head of the International Vaccine Institute is recommending that instead of moving immediately to booster shots for the already vaccinated, we should instead be prioritizing fully vaccinating those parts of the world that are at an extremely low vaccination rate. In other words, partially, I don't even know if the word partially, baseline vaccinating everybody instead of giving boosters to people who might more need them in the United States. I guess it's a little bit awkward phrasing. Not more than the people who are in the other countries, to be clear. We'll come back to this. This is one of those conversations that we had actually last week for a minute. We're often early on this stuff. Texas Governor Greg Abbott, who is leading the charge against mandating vaccines and masks with Governor DeSantis, has tested positive for COVID-19. Likely Abbott got the virus from one of his, quote, standing room only events, end quote. Abbott told the press he had received a third booster shot before this positive test. So regardless of the conversation, governors are getting the booster shot. We'll come back to it again. In national news, House Democrats introduced a voting rights bill named for the late Congressman John Lewis, which would restore elements of the Voting Rights Act of 1965 and allow the federal government to block some changes to state election laws that it deems to be discriminatory. In international news, Afghanistan's youngest mayor on Sunday said that she's waiting for the Taliban to come and kill her. This was on Sunday. And again, that's pretty much the headline. We'll see. There's a lot to talk about with the Taliban because they are going for international recognition. They're addressing themselves to the world. We'll come back to it again. Carrying on, more related headlines. One of the leaders of the Haqqani Network is said to have held talks with former Afghan leaders about a new government. The Haqqani Network is an insurgent guerrilla group that has been fighting against NATO forces for the past several decades plus. The head of the UN Refugee Agency said that refugees should not be sent back to Afghanistan following the Taliban takeover, and that neighboring countries should begin creating escape routes for those wishing to flee the country. A top Taliban leader sat down with a female reporter yesterday for a live in-person interview with Tolo News. That's an Afghan news station. The act is to project a modern image from the new governing body of Afghanistan to the rest of the world. Many female reporters have reportedly been forced into hiding or are fleeing their homes. So this move makes the future of the treatment of women in Afghanistan unclear. In tech news, T-Mobile has confirmed a massive data breach on their servers affecting roughly 47.8 million people. Data believed to have been stolen include first and last names, date of birth, social security number, and driver's license/ID information. The culprit was selling information of around 30 million people in exchange for $270,000 in Bitcoin. This is the third attack the company has suffered within 2 years. In Earth and Science news, Jeff Bezos and Blue Origin are now suing NASA because of the Moonlander contract the government agency awarded to SpaceX. The lawsuit challenges, quote, NASA's unlawful and improper evaluation of proposals submitted under the Human Landing System Option A broad agency announcement, end quote. The documents regarding the case are sealed to the public after Blue Origin was granted a protective order on Monday. Amazon seems to be doing that, suing the government more than a lot of other entities would be. Between the Microsoft CIA deal, you remember they were competing with Microsoft for the CIA deal. Anyway, let's close it out there. You're listening to Fault Lines. Those are our headlines on Fault Lines. Weird morning. hoping to get into it more as the show goes on.
Yeah.
And, planning on it. But a weird morning so far. Regardless, a couple headlines to get back to here. For one thing, the booster shots.
Mm-hmm.
So last week we were talking about the booster shots in the context of this Thursday, potentially immunocompromised people being given access to them.
Right.
And I don't know if you're in that category, but you're adjacent to it at the very least. And so it was more applicable.
Yeah.
It was more relevant.
Yeah. Basically, they're saying that I think Biden's putting out guidance today or something, if I'm not mistaken, talking about 8 months afterwards to get a booster shot. And it sounds like just in general. But yeah, for people who are immunocompromised or who had some kind of immune issues, the concern was that the immunity wouldn't necessarily last as long as it would last for people with a typical and a normal immune, that type of stuff. But it's interesting to hear that the governor already got his booster.
Yeah.
I didn't know that.
It is.
So he's, despite the fact that
what's the air quotes there, Austin? Austin, you gave air quotes.
Air quotes for what?
For booster. He's going to explain over the thread, but there's some confusion here. Anyway, go for it, Jamarl.
Oh, I see. Well, yeah. I mean, it's pretty wild that he was able to get his booster already as governor. It's also something appalling about it. I mean, dude has made it difficult for masks. The school had to get around his mask mandate, if I'm not mistaken, by basically making part of the dress code. It's like, yes, I'm going to take these precautions myself. However, I will make it difficult for others in my state. It's just strange. There's also the secondary question of, do we get more bang for the buck with a booster, or do we get more bang for the buck by vaccinating the rest of the world? Meaning, there's only a small percentage of the world that's been fully vaccinated. And if the rest of the world was vaccinated, will you have this kind of pressure where it seems to be like going from place to place to place? Because what it seems like, something may start off in Peru, but end up in California. And so it's like, if Peru was vaccinated, would it ever get the opportunity to end up in California? I know it sounds a little strange. I mean, in our context, from our standpoint of the country, it is very difficult for a politician to take a position to give vaccines away if everybody in the U.S. is not vaccinated first. By the same token, an argument could be made that if you vaccinate elsewhere, that it does have some kind of internal effect at home.
Yeah, well, and a lot of people don't want to get vaccines here in the States, and so it's not like, there's a huge scarcity of them here.
Yeah.
And another side of this, though, is that with Delta, and just that as a big example, you see variants that break through vaccines. Therefore, is baseline vaccination actually all that useful for keeping down those breakthrough variants? What is it? It keeps you from, again, suffering its worst effects personally, but it doesn't keep you from passing it on, contracting it, anything like that. It doesn't seem to slow it down even. It just seems to pass through you.
Yeah, I don't know that. I don't know if that's true. From the standpoint of slowing it down, I mean, it is true that the people who are vaccinated are less likely to get sick. It's just true.
But it depends on what you mean by sick. It's true. They're less likely to feel sick, but are they less likely to contract and internally incubate and spread the pathogen?
I know, but if the majority of the people who are getting ill at this point are unvaccinated, then it seems like that would be the preponderance of
and again,
spreading.
The majority of people who are feeling the sickness, who are feeling its worst effects,
right,
when you say ill.
The catch is, though, and that was, one of the things that needed to be explained, where it doesn't make you bulletproof. Like, the vaccination doesn't make you, immune to every... No, there will be breakthroughs. There were always going to be breakthroughs. There was never a situation where there weren't going to be breakthrough infections. The catch becomes, is it beneficial? And the answer is yes. And does it cut down on the number of people who are infected, especially from the standpoint of vicious symptoms? And the answer is yes.
One quick comment on the Greg Abbott thing. I kind of want to come back on this, what you were just talking about, because I kind of disagree. But with Greg Abbott, apparently, he said that he got a booster shot, and he is now, the narrative is changing. He's saying that they don't work, basically. And he is also, people are accusing him of not actually having gotten the booster shot. And just, we were just talking about these parties. Yeah. He's basically standing room only, close quarter parties. He's basically, some people are saying, lying about having gotten a booster shot to justify having these extremely close quarter parties. In other words, I got it. We're safe. We're good to go, right? Let's all pack in.
I don't know why. There's nothing to make me jump to the conclusion he's lying. I don't know. I mean, it's very possible that he did have a booster.
Yes.
Who knows? I mean, the thing is, if you're in a standing room only party, Again, we've seen the Massachusetts case where if conditions are right, then it still can break through. And if you are in close proximity to people and he's kind of standing room only and people are just kind of hanging about, yeah, you can get sick like anybody else. It's not magic.
It's true. Okay, so here's the thing I wanted to push back on, which is the idea that I remember people talking about, you can see this with Biden, the July 4th thing. If everybody gets vaccinated, we can just be out again.
Mm-hmm.
That was when we thought that there wouldn't be breakthrough cases or breakthrough variants, basically. That was when we were assuming that the vaccines would give us sufficient protection that we could be outside congregating. As long as you were vaccinated, you were basically safe to hang out around other people, that kind of thing.
Right. Which
isn't true. Has been shown to be not true. That's why we're all wearing masks again. It's not just about proving that any one person who's not wearing a mask is vaccinated.
Mm-hmm.
It's just that you're likely to spread it still.
Yeah.
If you have the Delta variant specifically. My point is there was a time when we weren't taking into account breakthrough variants.
Yes.
We were not thinking about that at one point. That wasn't always part of the narrative.
No, that wasn't always part of the narrative. That's true. By the same token, so do you believe that the same number of people, meaning do you believe that with a vaccine, you get sick at the same rate? And by sick, I mean infection or whatever else, whatever you define sick as somebody without a vaccine.
Of course not. No, but and that's been my entire case.
Right.
Is that we have learned that basically the only thing that vaccines have so far been proven to be effective at is that they do statistically reduce the incidence, the severity of the disease. The severity specifically, not the incidence. The severity of the disease.
Right. Again, I mean, that's why I'm asking you something very specific.
Yeah.
Do you believe that people who are unvaccinated have a higher propensity of catching the virus than people who are vaccinated?
I think it depends on the variant of catching the virus. Right now, based on the Delta variant, no. It seems like they're equally likely to catch it. Now, are they as equally likely to feel sick? Clearly, no. Clearly, the vaccinated are far less likely to feel sick.
Right.
But it seems like they're about equally likely to spread it.
Now, why do you believe that they're equal likely to spread it with the Delta variant? I mean, I get it. It's a variant, so don't misunderstand me. And I do get that there's breakthrough effects. But why do you believe that they're one-to-one? What is giving you an impression that these things were?
In Massachusetts, Colorado, and I believe Wisconsin, they were analyzing the nasal titers of the vaccinated and unvaccinated population with what they presumed to be the Delta variant. And they were identical with like fairly large sample sizes, looking at these cases where a large part of the local population was vaccinated and you had a bunch of them break through. And so then they were like looking at, one of the ways they would try to determine, is this person spreading, which is looking at the nasal titers, taking samples, and they were the same. In other words, the thing that they would be spreading was in the same quantities in the vaccinated and the unvaccinated people. So looking at that evidence, that seems to be the best that we have available, therefore.
But do you believe that there's a higher propensity for the people to get sick versus not? And I keep saying sick.
That's the thing.
What I'm getting at is people who are vaccinated have a less likely to get COVID. I mean, even with the variants, it's still providing protection. I don't necessarily know where you're getting the idea from that. It's no difference.
Because even when you say
those things,
get COVID, they're less likely to experience the effects of the disease, COVID-19. But it seems like they are equally likely to contract SARS-CoV-2, the pathogen. That's the thing.
And I don't know why you think that.
Because
it's true that people with the vaccinations have the capacity to spread it. And when you're looking at the thing that you're talking about is the amount of ability to kind of get that stuff out, meaning they still have viral levels and everything else.
Well, because again, this is kind of one of the things that you were bringing up. I'll go back to Massachusetts for a second. If you're talking about not just their ability to spread it, but their ability to get it, which is, of course, big distinction. Sorry for not cluing into that earlier. Massachusetts, you yourself, I was kind of pushing back on it. You were sending that article over, and that's just one that is representative of many. Were like 75%, and it was equivalent to the amount of people who were vaccinated in the population. Approximately 80% of the people there, 75 to 80% of the people in this local community were vaccinated. And then 75 to 80% of the people who caught COVID were also vaccinated. In other words, it was just a normal distribution across the population. Whether you were vaccinated or unvaccinated, you were catching it at the same rate. And that had been lining up with other similar results I've been seeing with the Delta variant specifically over the past month in the UK. And I believe if I were to go back and look at Colorado and Wisconsin, that would match up too. In other words, it was just infecting everybody, regardless of whether you were vaccinated or not. And you can kind of see that based on what percentage of the infected population is vaccinated. If that number is the same as the vaccinated percentage of the population, well, then very likely it's just infecting people. It's just regardless.
The Delta variant, the Delta variant does seem to infect people. No, I don't think people are getting infected at the exact same rate as a one-to-one, meaning vaccinated versus unvaccinated. But I do agree with you that from the standpoint of the viral load and everything else, yeah, that stuff was, somebody who was vaccinated could spread it just like anybody else who wasn't.
That's the thing. At the very least, it seems like they're very likely to spread it. And it may be that they're a bit less likely to contract it, but it is
that's the point that I'm getting at. Is
a bit, but I don't know. My point is maybe not. What is certainly clear is they can still definitely contract it fairly easily if they're in a room and the virus is circulating. My point is, if there's protection, it's marginal. It's not categorical in the way that the vaccines were sold to us, which they were sold as. If you get vaccinated, initially, you're pretty much safe. That was how they were talked about it initially.
Yeah, that was the way the
narrative
get back to life.
Has unconsciously shifted. We haven't discerned the shift in this specific remark or that one. You have to kind of connect the dots together. But the narrative is just osmosis into something different. It's completely different now.
Yeah. I don't buy the argument that it's a one-to-one in regards to the distribution. But I agree with you, though, that the narrative has shifted. Yeah. I mean, it went from you go back to your life, and then after a while, it was like, Mr. President, that's not going to
work. And really quickly with Fauci at the time, you remember, it was like one day they said,
because it was like 2 years. And people were like, whoa.
Oh, yeah, needing to wear masks while vaccinated.
Walked that back.
Yeah.
He walked that back big time. And here we are.
Yeah.
Masks, 1,000 people dying a day, back to this kind of worst case scenario.
Let's close it out if you're down so we can come back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We're coming back into Jamarl's monologue, our soapbox segment, with a short back and forth following. Be right back.
Fault Lines.
Radio Sputnik.
They're bringing drugs. They're bringing crime.
I like beer. Yeah, we drank beer.
Whoever's in charge, and I want them recorded.
Let's talk about that.
Discussing all the controversies and news across the disunited states of America. Tune in to Fault Lines every weekday from 7 to 10 a.m. Eastern, only on Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined with my co-host, Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. If you guys live in the area, you can catch us on radio at 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. We're also in Kansas City at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. If you guys are digging what Shane and I are putting down, whatever platform you're consuming this content on, give us a like and share that audio or video. If you want to join in on the conversation, you can do so with a chat, a tweet, and of course, you can reach us by phone at 202-521-1320. That is 202-521-1320. Your engagement helps make the show what it is, so definitely don't be shy. We are in a wake of the Taliban basically taking Afghanistan. Afghanistan has fallen. And one of the weirdest things is watching media, especially U.S. media, trying to deal with the fact that Afghanistan has fallen. For us to have invested so much money, and yet for us to get basically negative results. I mean, for the moment, think of the number of people that was trained. Think of the amount of money that was spent. Think of the amount of people that died. Think of the amount of civilians that died. I mean, as you go down the list and you tally up the results of this, disastrous, doesn't quite touch it. We have, looking at BuzzFeed, BuzzFeed went through an analysis basically trying to give an impression of what was spent and how disastrous this was, not just from the bottom line, but also from the standpoint of life and limb. $2.26 trillion officially the Defense Department basically spent dealing with veterans and veteran care and military equipment and everything else. For comparison, it would take $1.7 trillion to pay off all outstanding student loans, universal, high-quality early care and education for all children, $1.4 trillion. The cost of war was almost twice that of the $1.2 trillion infrastructure bill that they're trying to pass. You've had 775,000 U.S. service members that were deployed to Afghanistan at least once between 2001 and 2019. Seattle has 737,015 people in total, meaning that there were more service members that were rotated in Afghanistan than actually live in Seattle. You have 20,666 military, U.S. military wounded in action, 2,312 U.S. military deaths, 240,000 deaths as a direct result of the war, and this is Afghanistan and Pakistan. And when you get into civilians, this is when it starts to get that much worse. There's an insidious lie that's being put forth by Joe Biden that they weren't willing to fight, or why are we going to fight somebody who weren't willing to fight for their own freedoms? This is the trope that is now being bandied about, or women's rights, as if we were there for women's rights. Let's play the clip. I want to play the clip before going too far into it.
The choice I had to make as your president was either to follow through on that agreement or be prepared to go back to fighting the Taliban in the middle of the spring fighting season. There would have been no ceasefire after May 1. There was no agreement protecting our forces after May 1. There was no status quo of stability without American casualties after May 1. There was only the cold reality of either following through on the agreement to withdraw our forces or escalating the conflict and sending thousands more American troops back into combat in Afghanistan, lurching into the third decade of conflict. I stand squarely behind my decision. After 20 years, I've learned the hard way that there was never a good time to withdraw U.S. forces. That's why we're still there. We were clear-eyed about the risks. We planned for every contingency, but I always promised the American people that I would be straight with you. The truth is, this did unfold more quickly than we had anticipated. So what's happened? Afghanistan political leaders gave up and fled the country. The Afghan military collapsed, sometime without trying to fight. If anything, the developments of the past week reinforced that ending U.S. military involvement in Afghanistan now was the right decision. American troops cannot and should not be fighting in a war and dying in a war that Afghan forces are not willing to fight for themselves.
That's an astonishing clip. That is an astonishing clip. You invade a country, you occupy that country. Nobody told you to do that. You didn't have to do that. And on top of that, spending all of this money. And the catch is it true that Afghan forces weren't willing to fight? They weren't willing to fight for a corrupt government. That may be true. But even that is not entirely true, because you had hundreds of thousands of Afghan forces that actually died. And when you get into this notion of why did we lose this? Was there a potential chance of doing something different in this country? Maybe if you had an intention of doing something different, but I don't necessarily think that was necessarily the intention. All of the money that was spent, you had like 80 to 90% of that money recycled back into the United States in the form of like weapons contractors or consultants or whatever else. And in the very capacity of winning the hearts and minds, you can't have a situation where you're killing civilians in such large numbers and win the hearts and minds. I mean, on a conservative estimate, BuzzFeed has it at nearly 50,000 civilians. That number is estimated to be higher. This is a low estimate in regards to the number of civilians that were killed. It is hard to get across the damage that was done invading that country. It is hard to get that across. And the lives that were ruined, the displacement. More than 3.5 million people are now internally displaced in Afghanistan. More than 2.5 million Afghan refugees at the end of 2020. The idea that we've now gotten to the point of saying it's not our fault, and this insidious tweak of reality. Oh, they didn't want to fight. They didn't want to stand and fight. We were trying to help them. We were there just trying to hold their hands and try to help them fight against the fight against the terrorists. We were trying to help them fight for their freedom, but they weren't willing to fight for their freedoms, so we shouldn't be there. That is astonishing. That is an astonishing statement. How is it possible that Biden planned for every eventuality, but didn't necessarily know the place was going to collapse over the weekend? And what does it mean when a place collapses over a weekend after investing nearly $3 trillion into the place. And if, indeed, as you say it, they weren't, quote unquote, willing to fight for their, quote unquote, freedoms, then why not? Then why not? If it was indeed, quote unquote, freedoms in the way that you say it, if it was indeed this coveted thing, why weren't they willing to do so? And the catch is, they were fighting for that corrupt government. It just became clear that the U.S. was leaving. And not just became clear that the U.S. was leaving, the U.S. was losing all the way through this 20 years. To make this point that much more clear, there was a point back in, Operation Haymaker. There were files that were given over to The Intercept. And I remember this was years ago, where they were making a point that nearly 90% of the people that were killed in some of these drone strikes were civilians. You can't win the hearts and mind of a population when it seems like you're running roughshod over the population and you don't all that much care about the people that you're injuring, maiming, or in this case, killing. There's one more clip that I want to play because I want this gets to the perspective of media. And this was something that Shane brought up. The way that media would basically attack Biden for peace stuff. Meaning if he's pulling out of a country, they'll hit him for it. If he's trying to be conciliatory with Russia, they hit him for it. Listen to this person, this reporter, go after Jake Sullivan. Let's play this clip.
Thank you, sir. President Biden said that there were very few national security interests for the United States in maintaining some peace in Afghanistan. Would you actually reiterate that today? Would you say that there is no interest for us having some presence on the borders of Iran, on the borders of Pakistan, on the borders of near China? Would you, or Tajikistan? Would you say that we should just give that up?
I would say that the president does not believe that the United States should be fighting and dying in a war for the purpose of sustaining American military boots near Tajikistan or Pakistan or Iran. No, I would say that that is something that is not. What you just laid out as a national security interest, we would not agree that it is right to ask American soldiers to risk their lives for the purpose of maintaining a presence near Tajikistan.
How weird is that? How weird is that?
It actually sounds kind of reasonable there. Listen to
Yes.
that.
I mean, but just the idea that the reporter's like, hey, a presence in Tajikistan, isn't that important? I mean, I can't believe Biden's going to pull out of this.
I'm going to need you to pull out a map to
Yeah.
help me locate it.
Yeah.
But
I need that reporter to suit up. That's what I need. I need that reporter to suit up. If he's that strongly about it, where he's like, we need to go in there, we need to stay at the border of Iran and China. Think about what he's saying for the moment. We've been there for 20 years. We spent nearly $3 trillion, and the number is probably going to be more than that at the end of it all. And he's like, we should just stay forever, not for any like real legitimate thing for Afghanistan, but because, you know, we have other people that we want to keep an eye on. We are supposed to invade and occupy a country for this guy's interests and keeping an eye on Iran, China, and Russia. Think about that. I mean, that's so, I don't think people realize how extreme that is. That conversation only works for an American audience. That only works for an American audience. Because the idea that you can occupy a country just to keep an eye on somebody else seems to be astonishing to me. What are your thoughts, Shane? All of this, just to nutshell it, they are moving the ball in regards to why all of this happened and why all of this failed. And nobody wants to own up to the fact that this was a waste. And they're trying to find every reason to basically blame Afghanistan for something that was our doing. What are your thoughts?
well, I guess that's kind of the most convenient party to blame here for a couple of reasons. Partly because it no longer exists, and therefore, who's going to seek retribution on us for it? It's not like we're blaming China or Iran or some other countries that's going to have an opinion about it. Ghani fled. Reports vary as to exactly where he is right now, what his fate is. My point is, who is the Afghan government? You know, the former Afghan government. Ghani, you know, his crew, whomever. Whose repercussions do we have to fear? You know, what whiplash do we have to fear? That's my point.
Yeah, it's like they're easily blamable because
at this point they don't exist, frankly, and they were always our puppet, and so it's like, you know, they're the easiest party to blame. Blaming them doesn't incur any resentment that might come back to bite us. Is my point.
It's just such a slap in the face.
It totally is.
I mean, it's like you know, hundreds of thousands of Afghanis died. And, they missed the point about, hey, it was radically corrupt. The public understood it was radically corrupt, meaning there's no introspection into, okay, how did all of this fail? Why were all of these lies being told for all of these years? None of that is done. Afghan government's fault. They didn't want to fight for their own freedom, so,
It might be a slap in the face for the Afghan people, but they'll probably prefer that small slap in the face to everything that's been going on. In other words, and I got to remind myself too, it's like a lot of people didn't know what 9/11 was years after, as we've heard a couple times in the last couple of days. A lot of people living in Afghanistan had no idea why American forces had invaded, and therefore the vast majority of folks probably won't hear anything about this. My point is, if they do, it's probably like, okay, whatever, bye guys, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
But the conversation that's kind of interesting to me that I don't think we've had so much is, what about all the people, say they're not translators, but say they are more secular, maybe non-Sunni Afghans who really did kind of like where the U.S. was taking things. They didn't like the corruption of the government, but they're not Sunni, and they don't like a Taliban-run Afghanistan. And now whether they're living there or they're living abroad, they're going to have a say on that. That's going to be the big anti-Taliban lobby, I would guess, that and the neocons military-industrial complex, but it's going to be these emigres or these dissidents within the country who are trying to align with the West. Are we going to court them? I don't think so. We're just going to abandon them? Probably, because it's no longer our interest to be there. How are they going to take that? I don't know. But it's just interesting to think about, because we've done this. We did it, obviously, in a very, very different way. But using the Kurds, for instance, that's just recent history. We've just done that in the last couple of years. We're using them and then just sort of ignoring them, turning our back on them.
It's like this kind of transactional politics. Thank you for your help. We're going to leave you in a lurch now.
Yes.
I mean, that's basically what they did.
We're not going to guarantee you a country, right, in the case of either Kurdistan or a secular Afghanistan.
And, something like that happened with, if I'm not mistaken, the Dutch. Yeah, the Dutch. So the Swedish, I just read it. Swedish staff left the embassy as their Afghan colleagues worked. They refused to answer calls from Afghan staff and even blocked their official email accounts and left the country. Because at this point, it's like, everybody's leaving. I want to thank you guys for your help. We will not be receiving your phone calls from here on out.
Yes.
Thank you for your interpreting and everything else, but I'll see you guys later. I don't know if you've seen, there was a Vietnam one that was very similar to this, where people were trying to get out of Vietnam, and you had people who were either interpreters or people who were working with the U.S. military, and they were trying to find ways to get those people who were associated with the military out of Vietnam. And there's, the backstory on the people who were left behind, what they went through, all this stuff is utterly fascinating. And it keeps putting me in mind of this. The situation is very similar, like this kind of fall of Saigon, fall of Afghanistan, and the things that people do to try to get the people out at the last minute, et cetera, et cetera. It's this. Let me ask you this. Do you think that there are consequences for Biden domestically? And we could get into this with some of the guests. But I'm just curious in general. After watching the place basically collapse like that, the American public initially was like, yes, we want to leave. And then that number dropped to like 49% when they, I guess, saw everything fall apart on the television. I'm shocked that it was falling apart. And I would imagine on some level embarrassed by the fact that it was falling in the way that it was. Are there consequences for Biden on this outside of just his polling?
Yeah, you're talking about the public reaction to it. I think it really depends on whether the Taliban goes through with what they've said they'll do and lets people flee, lets people evacuate, issues pardons, doesn't try to, because they've said they're just going to issue blanket pardons for like everybody. If they go through with that and no American is harmed, and in somewhat timely order in the next couple months or whatever, all the people that we want to get back, then no lives will be lost, and Biden can say, guys, I'm on my first year. This is a 20-year war that I've stepped into. I'm paraphrasing. Or this isn't exactly what he'd say, but basically he can pull the Obama dealing with Bush's crisis thing, where technically, this happened under my watch, but guys, I'm inheriting this mess from everybody who came before me. And there were problems, but this is a big thing we've been dealing with for a long time, and nobody, we made it out. We made it through. We're out of that war, and we can reprioritize. I don't know. But the big thing is, if no Americans are hurt by the Taliban, and if everybody gets home safe, then I think he's pretty much in the free and clear at that point.
It's very interesting. I'm not entirely sure. I don't know how often. I got to be honest. I've never seen anything like that on my airwaves, like where it seems like for us to be there for so long, like the majority of my life. Is that true? Almost the majority of my life, almost half of my life, we've been in Afghanistan. Like, to put that in perspective, it's massive. And it's like, to have the public knows we invested a ton of money. The public knows we invested a ton of lives. And for it to collapse, like, all at once in this kind of real, splashy fire and whatnot. And the public or the media is just kind of wagging their hands like, oh my God, I can't believe this happened. I can't believe this happened. I don't know. You might be right. The public may look at it and say, okay, we're out. And they may forget and just kind of move on. Or that could stick in their minds in the same way that Saigon stuck in the minds of people during Vietnam.
No, I don't think it would. I think the real cost with Saigon and Vietnam was the draft,
Yeah.
People felt that there was like personal skin in the game where if you got the wrong ticket on the lottery, you were getting sent over sooner or later.
Yeah.
That really sets people against something. This is less personal. And we'd also been planning on pulling out, It's barely a month away. It's less than a month away. Definitely.
Have you heard Pence's statement?
What did you say?
Pence made a statement saying, well, this is Biden's fault because if he would have pulled out in May, it would have been far smoother.
Yeah. I don't buy that either.
No, I don't buy that either. Do you think this would have been different under Trump?
I think because he would have pulled out sooner, the Taliban would have had less time to advance, and therefore, whatever plans they made, they probably would have been able to follow through on a bit better, if that makes sense. Just because by drawing it out more, it gave that much more time for the Taliban to make these massive offensives that won them the thing.
Their gains.
Exactly. Like, I'll put it like this. Take this. This is ridiculous, but let's just assume this timeline exists in every parallel universe. In other words, the Taliban takes until approximately mid-August to take Kabul.
Mm-hmm.
If we'd left Afghanistan in May under Trump's timeline, we'd be out months ago, so we'd be free and clear. Now, that wouldn't be the case, but still, it's probably more the case than it is under Biden. And therefore, it probably would have been better. But
I would just say it's still wild, and it's still bizarre. I'm glad we're gone. But by the same token, I still recognize that there will be consequences. And, the consequences, I don't think necessarily know what those are yet. I mean, people are, like you said, Taliban are basically acting as if they're more sophisticated, and they may be. And on some level, if they're going to try to rule the entirety of the country in a way that they never had before, they may have to be. But again, I don't know what that means. It becomes, it's like, are these guys going to moderate their position, or are these the same old Taliban who's just gotten better at propaganda to pretend as if they're going to moderate their position? I guess we'll know. We'll find out one way or the other.
It's true. Yeah, I'm sure neighboring countries are looking on with an abundance of caution, and we are looking at Afghanistan with a mind for scarcity. We're going to Mark Frost, talking economics and more. Specifically, I'm gonna out him. Mark Frost sent me a black humor joke, which I thought was kind of funny. But he said the price of burqas is going to skyrocket in Afghanistan pretty soon. Black humor, but technically 100% correct. You might have seen this. We're going into a conversation with Mark Frost. You might have seen this, Jamarl. Women who in the days before the takeover of Kabul were looking like Western women on Western TV outlets, and then days after, they're putting on burqas, and suddenly they look like they're living in Afghanistan according to our preconceptions because they're living there. They're there now. They're dealing with the new regime. Anyway, we're going into this conversation talking about Afghanistan for a minute and the economy in general with our next guest, Mark Frost. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Be right back.
Fault Lines.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
So, Sean, what do you want to talk about today?
Well, Bob, that's easy. I want to talk about the need to stop the development of self-driving cars.
Again, Sean, you're driving me nuts. I think the self-driving car thing's already out of the gate.
No. It's never too late. See, now the leading experts in the field, just pick one, whichever one, leading experts have repeatedly warned us about the dangers of artificial intelligence. Look, I'm telling you, man, we have to stop the robots by any means necessary.
I see what you did there.
Yep.
Tune into our show By Any Means Necessary daily from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern Time on Radio Sputnik. And don't forget to call in at 3:20 p.m. to our studio number 202-521-1320.
And if you miss us live, check us out on SputnikNews.com, Spreaker, iTunes, iHeartRadio, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts and stay up to date on the latest political, social, and economic movements shaping the world around us.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, and we're talking about Afghanistan and economics. A couple different sides here with our guest, Mark Frost. He is, for those listening, an entrepreneur, economist, professor, consultant, drummer, Eagle Scout, Marine, capitalist, Schumpeterian, and recovering libertarian. Mark, thanks for joining us this morning. How are you doing?
Doing quite well. How about you?
Good. Better for having you with us. Let's get into it. You sent over a couple of messages about Afghanistan. You're a classical, as far as I know, anti-war guy. That's one of the things, broadly speaking, don't mean to sort of put you into too much of a box, but, you know, a Tulsi Gabbard, that sort of end of things. You were happy to see the war end, I remember you telling me, but still kind of mixed feelings, right? Again, you're an economist, not a geopolitical analyst, but talking to you about it. What's your take on seeing this happen? How do you think Biden's faring? And looking at, almost 20-year war just come to an end, Taliban taking over Afghanistan. What are your thoughts, Mark?
Sure. One of my three areas of expertise in the field is abatement economics. What's the optimal quantity of bad things? And so I argue the optimal quantity of terrorism isn't zero. You're going to have terrorist attacks. You got to deal with them, that sort of a thing. So I was a young professor back when Afghanistan started, and I was very vocal on local news. I was on CNN. Anyone that would listen to me. I very adamantly didn't want us to go in there. I believe it was Colin Powell or somebody said something like, "This is the Pottery Barn rule. If you break it, you own it." And I didn't want to invade Afghanistan. I wanted to go get bin Laden. I wanted to go do a very concentrated, basically vengeance campaign on him. But I didn't want to actually invade Afghanistan because the history of America doing this, we suck at it. We've lost the will to do that sort of a thing. I knew we would go in there, and what we would end up with is absolutely corruption. And I remember my dad telling me about Vietnam. He didn't talk a lot about the war. He spent 3 tours there, 3 years. But when he did talk about it, he talked favorably. I mean, he killed a lot of them, but he talked favorably of the Viet Cong. He talked favorably of the NVA, that's the North Vietnamese Army. And he absolutely despised and had almost zero respect for the South Vietnamese Army, the SVA. They were corrupt. They didn't want to fight. They completely were codependent on American, not just firepower, but just American leadership. And so this seems to be the exact same thing that's going on in Afghanistan, and I think it's atrocious. One of the costs of war isn't just the money we spend on it, it's the opportunity costs. It's the lives that were lost. It's the kids that grew up without a dad. It's the other things that we didn't spend money on because we said, can't afford it, we got to go to Afghanistan. And at some point, if we're going to go play empire, you have to rule the country and you have to change the culture. We won World War II, and Germany and Japan worked because we stayed there and we were cruel. We didn't tell the Nazis, we want to respect your culture. And, if you want to stay Nazis, that's okay. We understand because we respect your culture. We didn't care about their culture. We forced them to denazify. Eisenhower ordered the shelling of a Bavarian village because they were sympathetic with the German werewolves and Hitler Youth. All the way into, and that was 1946. That was after the war. We've lost that either willingness or ability, for better or for worse, and we shouldn't go into these types of things because we literally suck at it. And the opportunity cost that we suffer is horrible. So my prediction is that I don't know exactly when it's going to be, but I bet it's not that long from now. All that money that we've spent in Afghanistan, not only are we not going to get a return out of it, it's going to have a negative ROI attached to it because those weapons are going to be used against our interests sooner or later if they're not already. It's a travesty. I think I do disagree a little bit with what you and Jamal said earlier. I think it would have been different with Trump to some degree. As you know, I'm not a big giant fan of Trump, but there is one thing Trump has going for him in this particular game theoretic model. I think the Taliban feared Trump. I think they thought he was tough, America first, and would bomb the crap out of them if they got out of line. I think that they view Biden as a Neville Chamberlain.
Interesting. You think they view Biden as a Neville Chamberlain? Maybe. I mean, but Donald Trump was the one that made the deal to leave. Why do you think? So you think it would have been different just because you don't think they would have tested? You think they wouldn't have tested Trump? That's the thought.
But also, real quickly, I just, Neville Chamberlain, that the implication is that the Taliban are the Nazis here, which I wouldn't say they're nearly that bad. I don't like them. I don't want to live under Sharia law. I have no particular affinity with the culture, but that was my only hedge there. Mark?
I think they're worse. I would rather live under the Nazis.
Really?
No, I wouldn't want to live under the Nazis. That seems really extreme.
Would with the Taliban.
Interesting.
Absolutely, I would.
But also, Jamarl said something.
That seems massively extreme. Why do you think that the Nazis are better than the Taliban? And this is a horrible a comparison between these two things. Like it's bad all the way around. But yeah, so let's skip that because that just seems bad all the way around. I am curious though, from the standpoint of opportunity costs, what should they have done then? I mean, you say you would have been perfectly okay with them going after bin Laden. We had the opportunity to do it. We basically passed that to the side. Are there costs or are there, let me say, benefits that these guys are getting that you would say that they are giving a larger priority to it than they should, if that makes sense? Like, for example, geopolitical influence being one. Like, I played a clip where the reporter was like, hey, shouldn't we keep our forces in Tajikistan? Don't we want to keep them there? It's that stuff, right? Is there something to that we do gain something? And this is I don't buy this argument entirely, but I do know that there's some neocons out there that do buy this argument. This notion of, well, there's certain geopolitical influence and there's certain things that we need to do from a geopolitical standpoint. And our influence, even if it costs a ton of money, is worth it.
Yeah, and those same neocons argue deficits don't matter. People like Cheney, his famous quote a long time ago. There is a theory, there is something in international political economy called the theory of hegemonic stability. And it basically argues that the hegemon, that is the 800-pound gorilla in the world, which right now is us, it used to be Great Britain, has not only a financial obligation, but also a moral obligation to be basically the policeman of the world. And we've taken that mantle on. I believe, the last time I counted, there's 195 countries on the earth. And we have forces, non-embassy forces, and I believe 171 of them. So, I mean, we have forces in almost every country. I don't think we have anything in Cuba, and I'd have to go look and see exactly which ones we don't have anything in. But most of the countries on Earth, we have non-embassy forces in, and that's the theory of hegemonic stability. And the neocons would say we have to do that. America must lead because if we don't, China will. And if China does, they'll become the hegemon. And now it's back to game theory. We have to become the hegemon because if we don't, someone else will become the hegemon, and that would be against the United States' interests. My problem with that is it contributes to crony capitalism. And what often that actually means is that we have to support international, multi-international, institutions like, big international corporations because it's in our vested interest to do so. Well, now we have to define what the word "our" means. Whose interest is it actually serving? It probably doesn't serve most Americans' interest. It certainly serves some people's interest. And I don't think we had to go to Afghanistan at all in terms of ruling it, in terms of actually invading it. We had bin Laden. We had him almost encircled, but at the last minute, Bush was worried about offending Pakistan and offending the Islamic world, and they didn't loosen the circle that they had around him. They had him. And all they would have had to do was to just keep tightening that circle, drop fuel-air explosions right into those caves, do it for about 6 months, and just blow the place to death.
Well, but they also, here's the thing, man, that gets grisly. They also had, the Taliban had offered to the Bush administration.
War is grisly.
Well, of course it is, but I'm saying if you don't need a war is by definition, unless it's a very strange and Yeah, war is by definition grisly. But if you don't need to start a war, you probably shouldn't. And if the Taliban would have given bin Laden to us, which they said they would have, if they had been given information establishing that he was responsible for the attacks on 9/11, that was a critical thing at the time. If we had done that, theoretically, we could have avoided all this blood loss, the trillions of dollars cost. In terms of abatement, that seems like a pretty solid deal, right?
Well, from what I've read, there was an article in the Wall Street Journal, I believe, either last night, it was sometime yesterday, and they were, and they had interviewed a senior Taliban person, and they did not believe Bush was going to actually do what he did. Had they known that, they would have given him up. Is supposedly the story, and that's what I'm talking about Biden and Trump. Trump is seen as a little bit crazy, and they might even think he might nuke them or something. And Bush at the time was seen as weak, kind of a cowboy from Texas. No, they did not believe that level of violence would be chosen in that. And had they known that, they would have given him up. But regardless, war was necessary then because we were attacked. Now, if you want to talk why we were attacked, and if you want to talk about root causes and all that kind of stuff, we can go back decades and we can talk about how we've interfered in the Middle East and how we've made enemies.
And the Mujahideen and creating, funding them and ultimately creating the Taliban, giving rise to it. But also, Scott Ritter, as he has so helpfully reminded us a couple of times, this was planned in Hamburg, Germany. It wasn't planned in Afghanistan. Afghanistan, the Taliban were effectively, I think the phrase was, serving as a hotel for bin Laden. Now, you can say they shouldn't be or whatever, but my point is, we invaded a country that didn't declare war on us, that didn't plan or execute that attack on us. We invaded a completely irrelevant country. Mark.
I wouldn't say it was irrelevant, but I do sort of sympathize with, I think, what you're implying. We didn't declare war on it, and that's one of my problems. I don't think, other than rescuing an embassy, things like that, I don't think we should conduct military operations without a declaration of war.
I don't think the issue is that we didn't declare war, Mark. I think the issue is...
Agreed on that real quick. I just agreed on that last point, but Jamarl, sorry for cutting.
Oh, yeah. I don't think the issue that we didn't declare war. I think the issue that Shane is making is that we attacked a country that wasn't necessarily let's say, the main planning or staging area for the attack on the soil. I think that's the point that he's making. The declaration of war, yes. All things being equal, if you're going to declare war, you should declare war. But I think that's almost secondary. What are your thoughts, Mark?
Well, one of my interests is military history because there's so much economics in it.
Yeah.
And violence without a declaration of war is just violence. We committed violence against a country because they wouldn't do what we wanted. They would not give over a fellow Islamist, which is part of their culture. And we said, well, if you don't give him up, we're going to invade you. And so we invaded them. But we invaded them, in my opinion, on a half-assed basis. The only thing that makes war worth doing is victory. If you don't win, it's just violence, mindless violence.
Yeah.
Should have learned that from Vietnam. We should have learned that in Lebanon. We should have learned from our mistakes. And either you go win. General Patton said it real well. People think he was a warmonger. Maybe he was. But if you look at the statistics on his casualties, he lost more people per day than, say, Omar Bradley, considerably more. But his campaigns lasted 1/20th as long. His actual total casualty rate was low. A short war where you win it, and you win it brutally, if that's what it takes, saves lives. The atomic bombs on Japan saved millions of Japanese lives. It was...
That's
not true.
That gets extremely controversial, but that's its own sort of hornet's nest that people have debated about for 70-plus years.
Well, because it's true.
It's not true.
Well, again, that's one of those, you can hear it.
What do you do? You believe that dropping the atomic bomb on Japan saved lives?
Oh, absolutely.
Why do you believe that? Japan was already putting out peace feelers before those bombs were dropped.
All you have to do is go look at the history of it, and then you look at the expected casualties of an invasion of Japan, a conventional.
I know that's the excuse they use, Mark, but I'm saying they were already putting out peace feelers before. Meaning that they dropped that bomb. They didn't have to drop that bomb.
We didn't want that. We wanted unconditional surrender.
No, I get that, the unconditional surrender part. But you understand, some of the bombing runs that we had done before.
No, so for us to have invaded Japan would have resulted in at least 1 million Japanese deaths, maybe even 2 million. We would have continued to firebomb all their major cities. We would have blockaded them and starved them into complete submission. Dysentery, disease, all sorts of stuff would have plagued that country. And instead, they lost a couple 100,000 people. Now, that's a fact. Now, you may not like the fact, but that is a fact, and you can go verify it.
Oh, Mark, I don't doubt that they lost X number of people and that the bombs were bad and everything else. I'm making the point to you that they were already putting out peace feelers, meaning the bombs were dropped. Yes, you might say that the United States wanted complete and unconditional surrender. I am making the point to you, though, that they were already trying to surrender. That's the point that I'm trying to get to you.
And I'm making a point to you that your information is flawed.
No, it's not. I think yours is.
The government was never wanting to surrender. What they wanted was a negotiated peace. They wanted a conditional. They didn't even want to surrender. What they wanted was a conditional ceasefire and just let things.
A peace treaty. A peace treaty is another sort of way of putting that. In other words, an unconditional surrender, they wouldn't require a treaty. They would just put up their white flags and there wouldn't be any talking, basically. But they wanted to negotiate. They had taken over large parts of China, and of course, Southeast Asia is a big empire at the time. They'd grown rapidly. And so I don't know what the current world situation, to Mark's point, would look like if we had gone through that negotiation on that peace. Would they have just asked for the annexation of like Manchuria or large parts of Eastern China? I don't know what that would have looked like. On the other hand, Mark,
at that point, Russia had started, even the Soviet Union even started going after Japan.
They had.
So yeah, this is nonsense, Mark. I don't buy that. I don't buy your argument on this, Mark. The fact of the matter is they lost. The United States didn't have to drop that bomb. The fire bombing and everything else was doing massive amount of damage to the place. And like I said, at the point where Germany lost, well, it was mop-up operations. The other forces were coming to bear. So let me ask you this. So you believe that Japan was going to be able to stand against the combined might of the United States and the Soviet Union? Or the Allied powers, I should say.
I didn't understand what you said. What?
Do you believe that Japan was going to be able to stand by itself against the combined powers of the Allied forces?
Yes, for quite some time. They would have eventually lost, but not without probably up to 1 million U.S. casualties and millions of their own people. That's just a fact. I mean, you can go look at there. It's not like one crazy book. There are so many sources for this to go be studied. There was two big things on the Japanese mind: their feudal way of life, if you will, their essentially fascist way of life, and the emperor. So they got their wish on the emperor. So Japan wasn't truly a 100% unconditional surrender. So they got what they wanted on the emperor, but the insistence was that the government, the Tojo government, must be disassembled. There was even a coup attempt in Japan, several of them, by the Tojo government, even after Emperor Hirohito made his famous speech. They didn't want to surrender, and the Japanese at that time were ferocious, fanatical fighters that would fight to the death.
Mark, we're going to have to end this here. The voice that you guys will listen to is Mark Frost, economist, professor, consultant, drummer, Eagle Scout, Marine, capitalist, Jupiterian, recovering libertarian. You can find Mark on Twitter at Frosty Cash. This is Fault Lines, Thomas Stranahan. Back in a moment.
listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault lines.
Live from the divided states of America, precipitously perched at the edge of this resilient and exploited globe. Welcome to your context lens for the American perspective. In the left corner, I'm your ever-vigilant, your indefatigable political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And in the independent corner, I'm your political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
That would mean you are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. All right, let's get to the headlines. About 100 in the news. About 144,297 new COVID cases were reported in the United States yesterday, and there were about 993 new deaths. Over the past week, there's been an average of 139,872 cases per day, an increase of 52% from the average 2 weeks earlier. 51% of the total American public has been fully vaccinated, and 60% of residents have received at least one dose. As of this morning, the coronavirus has infected 37,133,674 people across the United States and has killed 623,237 human beings. Newsweek is reporting the head of the International Vaccine Institute is recommending that instead of moving immediately to booster shots for the already vaccinated, we should instead be prioritizing fully vaccinating those parts of the world that are extremely or that have extremely low vaccination rates. Texas Governor Greg Abbott, who is leading the charge against mandating vaccines and masks with Governor DeSantis, has tested positive for COVID-19. Likely, Abbott got the virus from one of his, quote, standing room only events, unquote, an event designed with spacing opposite of social distancing. Abbott told the press that he had received a third booster shot before this positive test. That should be able to be verified, thinking about it. I mean, you would think that he would have a vaccination card or something. House Democrats introduced a voting bill named for the late Congressman John Lewis, which will restore elements of the Voting Rights Act in 1965 and allow the federal government to block some of the changes to the state election laws that it deems discriminatory. Afghanistan's youngest mayor on Sunday says she's waiting for the Taliban to come and kill her. This is in line with a lot of consternation for many of the women in Afghanistan who, with the rest of the world, don't quite know what to expect in the coming months. Despite the Taliban stressing that they're going to stick up for women's rights under an Islamic context, we don't quite know what that means yet. I would imagine in the coming months we will find out. One of the leaders of the Haqqani Network is said to have held talks with former Afghan leaders about a new government. The Haqqani Network is an insurgent guerrilla group that has been fighting against NATO forces for the past several decades. The Taliban has set up checkpoints all over Kabul where residents' smartphones are being searched for evidence of communicating in English or affiliation with Western governments or organizations. One of the biggest checkpoints is stationed at Kabul's airport, severely increasing the difficulty of evacuating the public. For example, a German A400M Airbus with a capacity of 100 people departed from Kabul with only 7 passengers. Wow. There's another story here that we need to cover dealing with biometrics data. We were trying to get biometrics data on the overwhelming majority of the Afghan population. I think it was like 80% or something to that effect. That equipment and the data from that equipment is still in Afghanistan and is basically falling into the hands of the Taliban government. So you can imagine that if you had people who are interpreters who are assisting the U.S. military or working with the United States military, if their biometric data is there, we may have just handed it over to the Taliban.
It's called the Handheld Interagency Identity Detection Equipment, HIIDE, that basically, like you're saying, you know, whether it's reading irises or scanning your fingerprints is used to create a biometric database like you're talking about. Yeah. And they've seized it. There's
something deplorable about doing that on a subjugated population. It feels weird. It's like we're going to invade a country and then we're going to try to get biometric data on pretty much everybody in the population so we can. I mean, that's very creepy.
Sounds like something that aliens would do.
Yeah, I mean, it's like we're going to
aliens.
Yeah, I was going to tag and give a barcode to each and every person so we can, keep track of this person or that person. That's very, very creepy. To invade a country and do something like that. That's extraordinary. The head of the UN Refugee Agency said the refugees should not be sent back to Afghanistan following the Taliban's takeover, and that neighboring countries should be creating escape routes for those wishing to flee the country. A Taliban leader sat down with a female reporter yesterday for a live in-person interview with Tolo News. The act is to project a modern image from the new governing body of Afghanistan to the rest of the world. Many female reporters have reportedly been forced into hiding or fleeing their homes, so this move makes the future treatment of women in Afghanistan unclear. That's exactly what it's for. T-Mobile has confirmed a massive data breach on their servers, affecting roughly 47.8 million people. Data believed to have been stolen include first and last name, date of birth, social security number, driver's license, ID information. The culprit was selling information for around 30 million people in exchange for $270,000 in Bitcoin. This is the third attack the company has suffered in 2 years. Jeff Bezos and Blue Origin are now suing NASA because of the moon lander contract the government agency awarded to SpaceX. The lawsuit challenges NASA's unlawful and improper evaluation of protocols submitted under the Human Landing System Option A broad agency announcement. The documents regarding this case are sealed to the public after Blue Origin was granted a protective order on Monday. Those are your headlines. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. When I see stuff like that, it makes me greatly annoyed. What right does Jeff Bezos and Blue Origin have to a contract? I mean, I don't know. I need to see the details in regards to what he's alleging. But this is like the second lawsuit that he's sued some other government agency because he wanted a contract that the government didn't necessarily want to give him or that he couldn't win. It's just, I mean, you can make a point, I guess, he's a business guy, so fair enough. The way he's looking at it is just bottom line to him. But there's something distasteful about it to me.
The other one's with the Pentagon and Microsoft.
That's what it was.
$10 billion cloud computing deal.
It's like if you can't win, just sue. If you can't win, just sue.
Yeah, well, and Amazon has the war chest, I would guess, to draw on to be able to execute these lawsuits. And of course, these are big contracts. That $10 billion one that we're just talking about is nothing for even a company of that size to sniff at. That's what they're going to do. That's what they're doing. But it does seem a little bit petty. It comes across as like, okay, you gave it to them. Well,
it's like you're suing NASA.
Well, so just wait while I pull out this rule book and slap you upside the face with it.
There's another story that I wanted to get to. I don't know if you've heard this one. So Tennessee top vaccination official, Dr. Michelle Fiscus, told state investigators on July that she received a dog muzzle in the mail, which she deemed to be a threat to keep her quiet. The muzzle, however, was bought on an Amazon account and with an American Express card in her name, according to state investigators, Monday. Think about that. So basically, to make a long story short, pediatrician, she was state medical director of vaccine preventable disease and immunization program. She was fired on July 12th in a political, what they call a political firestorm, when she was trying to basically get kids vaccinated, long story short, or adolescents vaccinated. So the thought is, this muzzle, all of a sudden, she came out with this several days later.
This is the Juicy Smollett thing, isn't it?
Yeah, that's what it sounds like. It was a Juicy. Is it Juicy or Juicy?
I said Juicy Smollett. That's how they used to. When I was a producer on By Any Means Necessary, Eugene Puryear left to say good guy, although Jackie's doing a great job, but they would call him Juicy Smollett, which I thought was hilarious.
And Juicy is just funny. Juicy Smollett. I think Dave Chappelle used to call him that Juicy.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's basically what it is. And I guess maybe this is her way of trying to get back at them for doing this. I don't know.
For doing what, though? For giving her crap randomly?
I mean, she said she was fired. She said she was fired in a political decision who disapproved of her trying to outreach vaccines to teenagers. I don't know. Maybe this was just her way of trying to get back at him or something.
Maybe she was just having like a late night bender where she was feeling particularly like ordering a dog collar.
Because this is less than 2 weeks after she was mailed a muzzle.
Yeah.
Don't do that. Don't do that.
Well, the temptation clearly is often, to frame your enemies by buying yourself a dog collar as if they were threatening you with it. I don't know, man. It's a weird one.
Very, very weird case. One of the other ones, the Taliban thing. Let's go to that for a moment.
The Taliban thing.
I am enamored. And enamored might not necessarily be the right word for it, but I'll go with it anyway. On what is going to happen going forward. It's exciting in a weird way, but it feels wrong to say that it's exciting, if that makes sense. Because it feels like I'm looking at something at a distance. I feel like we have a hand in it because of the amount of money that we basically dropped into it, and the damage that was caused because of it. And as I watch it, there's this question to me of, okay, what's happening now? Oftentimes when you have events around the world, those things are often static. And so it's like this notion of things moving and things taking place, et cetera, et cetera. Oftentimes those things are static, and it feels like it takes everything forever to take place. And with this was decidedly not static. And not just decidedly not static, it went up in smoke over the course of seemingly a weekend. And on top of that, there are all of these questions now that nobody have answers to. Like, does the Taliban even know what they want? Like, meaning, do they even know what is going to take place in regards to what they're trying to accomplish in the country? Are they going to be a more sophisticated organization? Is that just for optics of it all? Is there business interests that would, kind of bring them down to modernity, or modernity and the business interests creating a restraining or a limiting fact? Kind of like Rick Sanchez on Rick and Morty. One of the episodes where Rick was trying to get this glowing rock, and it was like a Mad Max environment type place. And so he eventually says, okay, the way he ended up doing it was basically giving everybody electricity, everybody energy, power, cars, and everybody else. Everybody gets lazy. He just takes it and leaves. Modernity was the thing that basically brought everybody down, brought the hysteria down. Is it something like that where, are these guys so ideological where the economics don't matter? Where the relationships with countries like Russia, China, Iran, and some of these other countries that are that it doesn't matter? Or are they looking at the world and they're saying, all right, the world has changed and we need to accommodate something, even if it's still not necessarily going to be modern, but modern in their heads? I don't know. I mean, I look at this with a certain sick fascination because, all of this stuff is so many moving parts. And I don't think anybody entirely knows what this is going to look like in 6 months.
Including them.
Yeah.
Which is kind of one of the questions you're just asking. I mean, you can read, they've done multiple press conferences at this point, and you could read translations of that. And from what they're saying, if you can take them at their word, they want peace. They want to cause no problems for their neighbors. No. They want to have their country and do the things their way, including Sharia law and women having to wear burqas, which is what the West is going to frown at. If they're not doing public beheadings on a pretty regular basis, then maybe we can even get used to them being in the region without constantly feeling the need to criticize them. Yeah. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But that's also, these are all relevant questions. One thing that we haven't talked about yet that I was looking into yesterday following a conversation in the studio is the Panjshir region and
resistance.
Resistance specifically. We've been talking about the Uzbeks and the Tajiks, which it seems the Taliban has been making some successful inroads with.
Yeah.
And which had been, at least in part, I believe, parts of the Northern Alliance that had been fighting against Taliban rule late 90s, early 2000s. Yeah. Anyway.
Yeah, because the Taliban didn't have the entirety of the country.
Yes. So the Uzbeks and the Tajiks, it seems like the Taliban is making inroads with them. That would prevent a successful Northern Alliance, potentially, at least in part, from forming. But on the other hand, you also have the Hazara, specifically Shia Hazara, who it seems are using this region in the far north of Afghanistan as a refuge and are talking about waging ongoing resistance against the Taliban.
Yeah.
And that's just going to be a lingering thing that they're going to have to deal with. Anyway, but my point is, we haven't talked about that angle on the radio yet. I don't really see anybody talking about it. And admittedly, maybe we're just early on it. Maybe it's just right now isn't the time to have that specific conversation. What's the future of the country? Or maybe it is. And I want to talk to somebody about it is my point.
Yeah.
Trying to reach out to people. But basically, what ongoing internal security problems are they going to have to deal with? Because they're not a unified state. Right. The uncertainty that you were just talking about, like you were asking, do they even know what they're going to want or what it's going to look like? Well, if they have to deal with this ongoing insurgency, they can't right now.
Right.
And so that's a big part of, I think, how they're going to have to deal with it is dealing with their internal domestic stability, you know?
Well, and that's why they're looking for English translations and looking for people who might be part of the West. They're looking for infiltrators. They're looking for people who might be, are staying there and staying behind in order to give information and intelligence to Western power. That's what they're looking for. In their heads, this is still, on some level, a war, or at the very least trying to consolidate after a war. And from their point of view, we can't take chances. I think that's the way to looking at it. I'm very curious, though, on whether or not, like you were making the point about the Hazara, whether that's going to be an area of resistance. And I think that's where it gets, meaning, is the U.S. taking its ball and going home? Or is it still figuring out, all right, how can we make their life miserable? Kind of like Iran. When Iran, when Ayatollah took power, the U.S. didn't just leave them alone. We didn't just say, okay, well, you guys, you took your country back. Fair. It wasn't that. We still bomb Iran, still trying to attack them to this day, still, acting as if they've done something to us as opposed to the other way around. It's very strange. And so if we treated them that way, or countries where we've toppled, that have basically untoppled the toppling, to put it in a tortured way, what about this? And is this going to be another one of those situations? I feel very weird having this fascination with this, even though maybe I shouldn't. I mean, it's our job on some level.
Well, I think it's like I said yesterday, it's like a clinical curiosity.
Yeah.
I have a professional interest in seeing exactly how this happens. And in that sense, it's kind of exciting to watch.
It's that, it's exciting. I mean, it's you're watching something and that's what it is. That's what it is. It's like you're watching something in real time and you're covering it as it takes place. And it's falling apart. It's moving parts. It's happening extremely fast. You're aware that media was getting it wrong for so long that there's so many moving parts and so many things that are taking place all at once that it's exciting.
Totally. And we're coming back, talking about that, talking about the media's coverage of it, talking about Biden and just the travesty that is this war, what set us up for it, and media's coverage of it during, before, and since. We're going to be talking with Gareth Porter when we come back. Investigative journalist, author, and policy analyst specializing in U.S. national security policy. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Be right back.
Fault Lines. Want to talk? Get in touch with us at radio@sputniknews.com.
Want to know how international issues fit into local ones and how local issues fit into international ones? With the historical context to tie them together? Well, we're bringing it to you all by any means necessary. Tune in weekdays from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time to hear me, Jackie Lukman, alongside my co-host Sean Blackman. By any means necessary, your guide to connecting the social, political, and economic movements shaping the world around us.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined with my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. If you guys live in the area, you can catch us on radio at 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. We're also in Kansas City at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. If you guys are digging what Shane and I are putting down, whatever platform you're consuming this content on, give us a like and share that audio or video. If you want to join in on the conversation, you can do so with a chat, a tweet, and of course, you can reach us by phone at 202-521-1320. That is 202-521-1320. Your engagement helps make this show what it is, so definitely don't be shy. One of the weirdest things Shane and I were just talking about it, in the wake of Afghanistan falling, is the media's reaction to it. Washington Post, the Afghanistan papers, basically go through over the course of the last 20 years that they've been lying. And the device that is supposed to get that across to the American public, the media, did not do so. Which is why when the scenes are taking place with Afghanistan falling, you have all of these people, the American public, seemingly shocked by the whole enterprise, despite the fact that the people who are in the room should have known better. Media is taking this as if we were just there doing the right thing. We were just trying to help them out. And in the speech that I played earlier today from Joe Biden, Biden went so far as to say, well, we're not going to fight. Why should we fight for somebody who's not going to fight for themselves? Let's be very clear. This was not a noble war, despite the fact that media is trying to cut it as such. To have a conversation about this, we're joined with investigative journalist, author, policy analyst specializing in U.S. and national security policy, Gareth Porter. Gareth, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me. Good morning, guys.
Absolutely. So I've been wowed by media over the last several days. These guys basically got it wrong. They weren't reporting the reality of events on the ground. They just basically repeated whatever the administration over the last 20 years have said. But now all of a sudden they're experts. And they are cutting this, basically leaning into this American argument that, well, it was a noble war. We were doing the best that we could. We tried to help them out. We were fighting for their freedoms, but they weren't willing to fight for their own freedoms. What is wrong with that line of argument and that line of conversation by media?
Well, I think the more accurate question would be what's right with it, because there's nothing right with it. It's a complete sort of revelation of the media's complicity with the national security state. They are so infatuated by their relations with their sources, if you will, the national security state officials, that they simply cannot view the entire issue of Afghanistan in anything but precisely the same eyes that the national security state views them in. And I think that this is perhaps the most dramatic illustration of this problem that I can recall in my 15 to 20 years now following America's wars as a journalist. So, yeah, I mean, this is a remarkable story of journalistic complicity and lack of any independent understanding at all of the issues that they are addressing in either editorials or news coverage. Now, of course, there are exceptions to this, and you mentioned the Afghanistan papers, which is something that I think there are going to be more stories in the near future that will begin to present a very different view of this war as a war that was, whatever the intention, turned into something very different. And I think that it's terribly important for the American public to somehow be informed of that reality. And this is what I have been really doing for the past 15 years is sort of following the Afghan war story and discovering just how horrible the origins and development of this American war were. There's simply no excuse for this war. It was totally unnecessary from the beginning. There was no Taliban insurgency when the U.S. military took over and occupied Afghanistan. The Taliban had totally surrendered, wanted to live in peace, and the U.S. military, in its wisdom, refused to allow them to do it, insisted on essentially going on a rampage around Afghanistan, rounding up every single Taliban soldier that they could and putting them in jail. And of course, the Taliban were not going to stand for that, and that's why there was a Taliban insurgency beginning in 2003, 2004. And that is then what became the U.S. effort to suppress it, which, in my view, is the clearest example of a self-serving war, what many people at lower levels of the military have called a self-licking ice cream cone for many years that we've ever seen, because it's constantly served the interests of not the military in terms of the rank and file soldiers, but the hierarchy within the military, particularly the Army, but not limited to that, as well as some people in the Pentagon. To begin with, the military lobby for NATO, the people at high ranks of the military who had served in high-ranking positions in NATO and served as the lobby for NATO, talked Rumsfeld into turning over the war in Afghanistan to NATO. And Rumsfeld bought it. This was in 2003, 2004. And so beginning in 2005, NATO began to go into Afghanistan. Of course, they had no idea what they were doing. They screwed it up completely, just as the Americans did, only worse. And so this was the first instance in which this self-serving character asserted itself. And then as the Taliban quickly grew to become a genuine threat to the U.S. occupation, one U.S. commander after another used this as the opportunity to advance their careers and, of course, argued very, very actively that they were successful in suppressing they were being successful in suppressing the insurgency and sought to advance their careers through this sort of set of lies. And it became a pattern which went on time after time. Then, of course, there was a big bump in the military budget because of the Afghan war, and that created all kinds of opportunities for contracts with favored contractors. And all of this added up to a clearly self-serving war. So, I mean, this should have been obvious, but it's never been perceived by the media at all.
You say it should have been obvious. Yeah, it should have been obvious. I want to play a clip by Biden. Biden is giving the speech the other day, and I make the point, this is so insidious, because in this, he basically turns around and says, it's not our fault, even though he says, the buck stops with me. I'm Joe Biden, I'm the president. He, however, spends right much time basically blaming the Afghan army, blaming Afghan political leaders, without entirely dealing with our own fault within the context of this very specific issue. Let's play this clip.
The choice I had to make as your president was either to follow through on that agreement or be prepared to go back to fighting the Taliban in the middle of the spring fighting season. There would have been no ceasefire after May 1. There was no agreement protecting our forces after May 1. There was no status quo of stability without American casualties after May 1. There was only the cold reality of either following through on the agreement to withdraw our forces or escalating the conflict and sending thousands more American troops back into combat in Afghanistan, lurching into the third decade of conflict. I stand squarely behind my decision. After 20 years, I've learned the hard way that there was never a good time to withdraw U.S. forces. That's why we're still there. We were clear-eyed about the risks. We planned for every contingency, but I always promised the American people that I would be straight with you. The truth is, this did unfold more quickly than we had anticipated. So what's happened? Afghanistan political leaders gave up and fled the country. The Afghan military collapsed, sometime without trying to fight. If anything, the developments of the past week reinforced that ending U.S. military involvement in Afghanistan now was the right decision. American troops cannot and should not be fighting in a war and dying in a war that Afghan forces are not willing to fight for themselves.
Gareth, Afghan forces are not willing to fight for themselves. I mean, basically, they're not willing to fight for our government. What's wrong with this statement?
Well, what's wrong with it? I mean, it's what he had to say was right as far as it went. But, of course, he failed to provide very important context for all of this, which is that the United States created an Afghan military out of whole cloth, which was never prepared to fight on its own. The entire process of creating it was such as to make it dependent on continued American, not just support, but direct involvement in the war indefinitely. And, you know, I mean, this is so obvious that it should not be necessary to say it, but any president who wanted to level with the American people would have to really make that clear. And it's not just that. I mean, there's a much more fundamental reality about this war that I think Biden certainly had some inkling of, although maybe he did not understand well enough. And that is that from the very beginning, when the U.S. military went in there, they made alliances with the warlords. And the warlords were these former Mujahideen commanders, who all of whom had militias who were the most vicious killers, rapists, would steal both the belongings, the crops, and the wives and sons and daughters of the people of Afghanistan without the slightest remorse, and who, you know, the United States made their main allies and then refused, of course, to do anything about their depredations on the population, which was the biggest single factor in making the Taliban popular.
Because they were opposing the warlords, right?
Yeah.
Because just to get into this, the Taliban was opposing the warlords. They were having this conversation about how they came into being basically, hitching on rides to protect these caravans that would be rolling through, and then creating sort of station posts along the roads, basically. And then they would go into villages, and then they would take them over. We're having a conversation looking at the origins of this stuff. But also the warlords, the rape that you were talking about, I was just looking into this yesterday. I believe it's bachabazi, the practice of rape, usually of young boys. The Taliban opposed that. Mullah Omar, early leader who passed away mid-2010s, a handful of years ago, he came to power in part on opposing that practice, right, Gareth?
Absolutely, no question about it. This is of the essence of the Taliban's becoming a popular force and really being able to inherit power in Afghanistan. It was precisely because they were the only ones who could do something about these corrupt, powerful, and really just horribly criminal former Mujahideen. This is why they are in power today. And I wrote a story, I think it was in 2011, about the U.S. military taking over new territory in southern Afghanistan. And behind them came in the police, who were part of the militias run by the warlords, who then started their rape and pillage of the population, and the population was extremely angry with the U.S. military over this, but the military wouldn't do anything about it.
And see, this gets to the whole thing about winning the hearts and minds, and this is what doesn't get explained, meaning this is not going to get touched on U.S. media in order to explain why it collapsed or why it collapsed so readily and so fast. That part gets glossed over. It's easier to believe that, oh, they're just weak. Oh, they just didn't want to fight for our corrupt government. It's very strange and it's very weird in the way that we talk about this stuff and the way we undermine or undercut these guys, despite the fact that, like you say, we're the ones that back them. The warlord issue is another issue that's really interesting to me. Will there be resistance? Or just if you had to prognosticate based on previous history, is this over? Or are the warlords or whatever warlords that are left over or whatever part of the region of the country where they may be able to get a foothold, resistance being anything, let's say Western countries or resources being dumped through some kind of conduit in order to kind of create this kind of insurgency or at the very least keep conflict going in Afghanistan? Or is this over with?
I think the answer is that probably only in the Panjshir Valley will there be some semblance of resistance, which will prevent the Taliban from completely consolidating power throughout the country. On one hand, I think it's the case that the Taliban have clearly shown their capability militarily here that will give pause to anybody who does not already have in being a force that is well-trained, disciplined, and capable. And on the other hand, the Taliban have been very assiduous over the past year or more in going out into areas where there are ethnic minorities, non-Pashtun minorities in Afghanistan who they clearly need to make sure will not turn against them once they're in power, and reassuring them that they will be well treated. The Taliban are not the same Taliban who took power in 2001 or before 2001, who were in power in 2001. They have learned a lot. They're capable of learning, and they're showing a degree of sophistication that, of course, the U.S. government and the U.S. media simply did not expect at all.
I want to come back to the media coverage here for a minute. And thank you, by the way, for getting into that last bit at the end about the Panjshir Valley and ensuing domestic instability. But coming back to the media, the way they hit Biden on this reminds me, of course, of the way they hit Biden on his meeting in Russia with Putin. And basically, those are the only two times they have criticized Biden, broadly speaking. Right. And I'm talking not just about Fox News, but MSNBC and CNN as well. And then you pair that with Donald Trump. Effectively, the only time they praised him was when he bombed Syria and pursued similar policies. So the media bias here is intuitively palpable, and it's very clear if you look at it and think about it. But I also, a couple other sides of this. I find myself asking myself, and I want to hear your take on it, why are they doing this? It's not just Mockingbird style top down, you're going to say this or that. It's their sources, broadly speaking, there's peer pressure, there's a bubble, but a lot of the sources that any given journalist working on this beat, their sources are military industrial, either not contractors, but intelligence community people. They're military people, broadly speaking. In other words, there's this back end influence that causes the media to be biased. And of course, that affects what information we get. Is that what you think it is? Or I guess I'll put it like this. That media bias is so sharp with both Trump and Biden on war. What do you think causes it? What do you think its effects are? Gareth?
Yes, I think you're absolutely right. It is primarily, although not exclusively, their reliance on sources who obviously are part of the problem, who are the problem. And the fear of losing those sources is ever present. But at the same time, they are getting very systematic, quiet, often implicit pressure, but sometimes very explicit pressure from their editors and publishers to ensure that they don't do anything to make the relations between the publication and the government or the military difficult. I mean, this is a long-standing problem going back deep into the Cold War. It hasn't changed for generations.
And that's the reason why you get this kind of weird bias, that it's not just these guys think within a certain tunnel of sorts, but also they're pressured to kind of go in that direction.
They're pressured in the most subtle kind of way, in a way that they would deny. And I've had conversations and heard them deny it. Systematically denying that they have any bias or that they would fail to, be objective in criticizing the U.S. military or anything like that. But it is systematic bias, which is built into the system for such a long period of time and in such a fundamental structural way that the people themselves in the media simply will not recognize it explicitly.
That's and that's what it seems. I mean, the gentleman, he wrote the book Reporter. I can't think of his name. It'll come to me. My Lai Massacre.
Cy Hirsch.
Right, Cy Hirsch. He makes that point. He makes that point extremely well, saying how editors will kind of, the stories that don't get aired or the stories that they decide not to select. Yeah. And after a while, you kind of get the hint, okay, these are the things that they want versus not. Right. This kind of subtle pressure all the way through the institution itself. So what happens from here on out? If this is indeed a more sophisticated Taliban, and it seems that way. I mean, the interview with the female reporter, that seems to be one of their ways of trying to get across, no, this is not going to be the exact 1.0 version that we went to prior. But there's still this question on how far does that go? I mean, when asked about women's rights, they made a point of saying, well, we believe in women's rights within the context of Sharia. And it's like, yeah, that doesn't really tell us anything. Is it possible that they don't quite know what Afghanistan is going to be under their own leadership themselves?
I think they may not know precisely how they're going to handle this. I think on one hand, they are clearly not going to interfere with institutions such as, those sort of modern institutions where women play important roles. They're not going to suddenly say, women have to go back home and not have jobs. On the other hand, they are going to continue, their basic viewpoints that women must be shielded, in everyday life, and for most of the female population of Afghanistan, we're talking about very poor people in very rural areas where they have not had opportunities because not just of the Taliban, but because of socioeconomic situations and the war. And so I don't. It's going to take much longer to see any change, any progress on the fundamental viewpoint towards women and their rights within the sort of everyday life of most of the population of Afghanistan. I think there's going to be a big distinction between those two parts of Afghanistan.
I am curious also going geopolitical influence, meaning countries like China, Russia have basically put out diplomatic overtures to the Taliban. What influence is that going to have within the country itself, if that makes sense? Meaning, because all of these countries on some level are going to have to work with the Taliban, regardless of what people think of them, they're there. And they've taken the country at this point. And so the countries that are trying to make these kind of diplomatic overtures, will the diplomatic overtures in and of itself have a certain leverage? Meaning whether it's economic benefits or whether it's some kind of benefits from the standpoint of consolidation, will that have leverage on the internal dynamics of the society in Afghanistan under Taliban control?
Yeah, sure. Of course, the Taliban are extremely dependent at this moment on getting international, not just recognition, but support. They need, to have resources coming into the country now that the United States is finished. And of course, those countries who sign up to have positive relations with the Taliban government are going to get some influence. I don't doubt that at all. No question about it. And I would say that sooner or later the United States is going to have to come back to reality and reassess its attitude towards the Taliban, and I think it'll start then playing a role itself along with China and Russia.
And how do you think that will, how do you think, just looking at the next couple of weeks or the next couple of months, leaving aside, longer lingering questions about political instability we're talking about, but just, do you think the Taliban will be able, how do you think they're going to do this? Do you think they'll be able to smoothly manage this transition into them being in power? Do you think that China, Russia, not to mention Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Pakistan, Iran, and India, all these relevant countries, how do you think they're going to feel about what the Taliban has done here? How do you think the Taliban is going to fare? How do you think that's going to play out over the next couple of weeks, couple of months? What do you think is likely here, Gareth?
I think that those countries are going to recognize the reality that the Taliban are handling this about as well as any government could handle the end of a 20-year war. The contrast between the way in which, mass media has characterized the end of the war and the reality is, just crushingly huge. This is a remarkable way of completing the war, of ending the war that they've managed to carry off. And I think sooner or later this is going to begin to sink in.
I want to, we've only got just last quick question with you, Gareth, here. Can you go into that for just a second longer? When you say it's sort of remarkable, the way they've managed to do this, what makes you say that? I could guess, but what do you mean specifically, Gareth?
Well, what I mean is that they obviously used negotiations with key people at the local level to get surrenders without a fight in one locality after another.
Yeah.
Made it possible for them to walk into to Kabul without a shot being fired. And any American who could have predicted that a few months ago or a month ago would get a prize for prognostication, as far as I'm concerned.
Very, very, very good point. And we'll be looking out for him to give him the prizes and to have him on as guest too. Gareth, thank you for joining us. Thank you for talking with us this morning.
My pleasure. Thanks.
For those listening, it was great talking. It was Gareth Porter just now. He's an investigative journalist, author, and policy analyst specializing in U.S. national security policy. Follow him on Twitter at Gareth Porter. One quick thing here, Jamarl, that just came to mind, and it's sort of obvious, but the U.S. media, Western media broadly, painting the Taliban as these big, angry militant forces that the Afghan army is basically surrendering to. Yep. They're so afraid of these big, angry monsters coming in. Whereas, at least from what Gareth just said, and from a lot of the conversations we've been having, it sounds like they have made deals. They have played diplomats and have managed to get a mostly bloodless victory here by, instead of, intimidating and using fear. I'm not saying that wasn't on there. They didn't have a stick. It was also diplomacy, negotiations, non-monstery things, if that makes sense. Yeah. I just want to say it's
a stick.
There's a sword. Yeah, using a stick, but also using a pen too.
Yeah.
Not just a sword. We've got to go into a break. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Coming back with Misty Winston, talking about Assange's revelations on Afghanistan, the part he played in revealing the problems with this war. A war that has just now ended. Again, we'll be back with Misty Winston on the other side of this short break. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Be right back.
Fault Lines. We are above all the latest developments, and we don't take any sides. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Are you bored? Are you lonely? Do you need a hug? Well, we can't give you that, but we can keep you up to date on Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined with my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. We are going to have a conversation about Julian Assange. We've been having this talk about Afghanistan. We've been talking about this for the last few days for obvious reasons. Afghanistan has fallen. We've invested nearly $3 trillion in an enterprise. It seems the least we can do is have an autopsy on the things that went wrong, the many things that went wrong. But one of the interesting aspects to this is what we know about Afghanistan. And a lot of that, on some level, Assange. One of the beauties of Assange, and one of the things that people keep making the point about, is that he gives you unfiltered information of things that are going on behind the scenes in a way that you would have never known otherwise. Despite the fact that when they're telling you this stuff, they're often telling you something different. Assange has been a great value. And as this was taking place, I thought to myself, what was the information that was exposed by Assange dealing with Afghanistan? And Misty Winston was the first person I thought about. The person who's joining us, Misty Winston, she's a political activist, organizer, co-host of both Facts on the Ground podcasts and Free Assange Visuals. Misty, thank you for joining me, or thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me back. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. And then, like I said, Assange, the information that Assange has been able to give on things of war, peace, behind the scenes, political machinations has been profound, to put it mildly. And I was curious about what information has WikiLeaks released on issues of Afghanistan, especially starting the start of the war, or for that matter, the propagation of the war, especially with drone strikes.
Oh, yeah. Okay. So the drone program was definitely exposed in the WikiLeaks releases multiple times over multiple different releases. As far as Afghanistan goes, WikiLeaks released 90,000 documents on the war in Afghanistan and how it was going, and really revealed it to be highly unorganized, underfunded, just really poorly thought out. And, you know, the releases that they put out covered 2004 to 2009 and really dove into just how, you know, terrible and how underfunded and under-resourced all of it was. You know, there were multiple different releases that showed different civilian deaths, hundreds of civilian deaths that were not reported previously. And so really what WikiLeaks showed is that this has always been, a war that we were never going to win.
Yeah.
We never had a chance.
And that's unfortunate. Has anything that Assange released, has it been able to augment how the war was fought, if that makes sense? Or for the most part,
no.
it was just giving clarity to what was going on behind the scenes in the war?
I wish that I could say that anything that WikiLeaks has released has really changed the way that we do things, the way that we conduct war, the way that the public looks at war. It's hard for me to say that that's really the case. I mean, he's currently in prison. So, if we took anything that he released seriously, I think that we would be heralding him as a hero, somebody who was, showing us the realities of war. And instead, the people who commit the war crimes are, running around free, and he's in, Belmarsh prison in London. So I don't know that anything that he's released has really made any, foundational changes or any fundamental changes. I think he has, what WikiLeaks has done has caused people to be faced with the reality of war, and to really have to take a really deep look at, what's actually going on, because, prior to the Afghanistan releases, we really had no clue what was going on in Afghanistan. And now the WikiLeaks releases are the only searchable database where you can go and examine what was actually happening there.
And okay, so main things here, just factually to get this out of the way. The main release, if I'm not wrong, was the Afghan war diary leak from WikiLeaks back in 2010. And I think that was the main one. Then there have been other sort of, there have been things that have touched upon it, like the Stratfor leaks. But that was the big cache, right? That was the big dump.
Yes, it's over 90,000 documents. That again covers the war from the period of 2004 to 2009, and it is a really it's like field journals from different military personnel, and so it really does give like a up close look at what's happening on the ground.
And then one more thing, I don't know if I'm disagreeing because we mean slightly different things, I think, but like looking at the major impacts of this. This is partly not Assange directly, but there's a way in which 100%, this is partly 9/11 and the war on terror in general. But if you think about Assange, clearly Chelsea Manning through Assange, but also Snowden right after. If Assange hadn't come out with that, I don't know if Snowden, hopefully it would have come out, but there was this wave of attention and action in the early 2010s that practically, I don't know how much it changed government policy, but was certainly a cultural moment that I think was really caused by Assange, was really caused by the Afghan War Diaries release, a sort of renewed wave of interest in the Afghan war, skepticism about it, criticism of it, that kind of thing. And, this generally online-based sort of digital dissidence or something like that against what the establishment was doing across the board. Do you see I think you see what I'm saying there, Misty?
No, yes. And I totally agree with you. I think more what I was saying is that I don't think that fundamentally, as far as like at levels of power, at levels of government, how we deal with war and things like that, I really don't think that much of that has changed yet. But you're right. I do think culturally, there's definitely more awareness as to what's going on. And you're right. It really did spark a wave of whistleblowers and of, just dissent of people, that are clearly tired of the way that Washington is conducting themselves and that are seeking. I mean, we now have a Daniel Hale, and we there are other whistleblowers who have come out that you're right. I don't think would have necessarily been inspired to do so had it not been for Julian Assange.
That's a critical thing. And I don't know, sliding door universes, who knows what would have happened. But no, but he was, my point in establishing first the fact of the timeline, Snowden was like 2013. This was 2010. This was a couple years in advance. In other words, Snowden looking at this, digesting it, thinking about it, might have been motivated by it. And I would bet would be partly.
That's a really good point.
Yes. I would say 100% you were absolutely right. And I think that really, what WikiLeaks did is make journalism as much as a science as humanly possible. They give you, it's source documentation. There isn't any conjecture. It's not like some talking head giving their opinion. It's, it's just 100% authenticated, documentation. And it allows the public to examine things for themselves and make their own determinations, which I think is incredibly valuable.
And, to your point, before the Afghanistan files from the Washington Post came out, there was the war logs. And one of the items that they talk about, a black unit of special forces that basically hunt or killed Taliban without a trial.
Yes.
I mean, like
the capture kill list.
Yeah, the capture.
It's amazing, right?
Utterly amazing. Or for that matter, covering up evidence that the Taliban had acquired certain weaponry and everything else. It's like this stuff was basically opaque to us and would have remained that way if it were not for
and
these
really,
files.
WikiLeaks also gave a voice to, hundreds, if not thousands, of victims of war who, civilian deaths that were otherwise not reported. And those people are now, counted. They're all, those are counted. And I'm sure that there are still others But, as far as like the Iraq war logs, which Jamarl just mentioned, there's 15,000 deaths that were unreported previously. And I think that that's a really important thing that, very often they lowball these civilian death counts to make things prettier for, the American public to take in. And, we really deserve to know the full spectrum of what's going on the ground.
And maybe it would be good if we can go back into it. 91,000 different docs released as a part of this cache. But like, what did we learn from it? What did we get out of it? That kind of thing. I'm trying to get a sense for what it gave us.
Well, I mean, again, what it did is it showed the kind of the realities of war. Like Jamarl said, it showed the capture kill list. It showed a lot of cover-ups going on as to what the Taliban was doing, who the Taliban was working with or for. It showed us that they had different weaponry that we didn't know that they had, or that they had access to different weaponry. It showed, the Pakistan and their relationship with the Taliban, and how they were funding or providing weaponry for suicide bombers, assassination plots. I mean, it really just goes on and on. It's a wealth of information, and there really isn't anything that, if you're paying attention to war, that's like earth-shattering, like, oh my gosh. But what it really does is it just puts it in sharp relief that this is what's happening. It's undeniable at this point. And it really, it's really incalculable, the level of importance that WikiLeaks has provided to us, I think, just on a broader spectrum in general, kind of culturally, like we were talking about before. This really does force people to examine, the mechanisms of war, the machinations of war, how we, conduct our wars. And really, it showed that Afghanistan was never meant to be a winnable war. I mean, Julian Assange once gave a speech or an interview where he was talking about how Afghanistan was really just it was really just being used as a way to essentially launder money for the United States and defense contractors. That was always the intention. It was never meant to be a winnable war. And that really, it's kind of sickening when you think of all of the hundreds and thousands of U.S. soldiers and Afghanistan citizens who were affected by this, who were, killed by this. I think that that's something that as a society we really need to grapple with, because nobody's really talking about what is the point of these wars? Why are we even there to begin with? Now with Afghanistan winding down, I think it's something that we really, as you said at the top of the show or at the top of the segment, we really need to do an autopsy on this, and we really need to examine why our leaders are taking us into these unwinnable situations.
Yes, and you can see with Biden's speech, even though I agree with some of the things he's saying, certainly getting out. Weirdly enough, playing Jake Sullivan this morning, I forget exactly what it was, but I was like, he's right about that. The person who's asking him, well, shouldn't we have American troops stationed on the borders of China and Tajikistan and Uzbekistan basically to keep an eye on them and to contain them? And Jake Sullivan's like, well, no, that would cost American lives, and we don't think that's worth it.
How many dead Americans do you want to keep troops in near Tajikistan?
My point is, setting this up, I can agree with them in the moment, but when they leave out such glaringly obvious facts as that, yes, we were in Afghanistan for regime change for certain periods of time, which Biden said we weren't. That's different from saying we shouldn't have been there. You said we weren't there. It clearly lies. There's one thing I wanted to come back to here, though, and it has to do with the timing in terms of this release about a little over 11 years ago from Julian Assange. This was right when Obama was doing his surge. If you remember, we were talking with Matthew Ho yesterday, veteran and somebody who came in, was asked to consult on the Afghanistan war right as Obama was escalating it, wanting to start the surge policy. That was in, I believe, it was in 2009. I was trying to recall the exact month, but it was in 2009. This was in July of 2010 that WikiLeaks released this, and it was in 2012 that Obama's surge was over. In other words, this was released right when we were escalating the war, and I can't help but feel that there's a motivation here. He's like, we're doing the internal monologue of Julian Assange. The United States is entering into escalating this war. They're making this a lot worse. It's about time that we get this material out. Do you see that kind of thing, Misty? The planning?
I potentially. I mean, really, WikiLeaks doesn't, it's not like they hold information. It's not like they control when they get information. They receive the information from Chelsea Manning, and I think that, they just went through the process of ensuring that it was safe to release these things. A lot of people will claim that he released things that put people in danger. That's not the case. They go through an incredibly intense redaction policy that they, to make sure that nobody is revealed in any way that would put their lives in danger. So I think that Julian Assange in general as a person, and I don't know him personally, so I'm just, speculating here, but I think it's obvious that he is a very anti-war human being. Yeah. And I think that, that was always a motivating factor for him just in the creation of WikiLeaks in general. I think that he really wanted to have Yes,
Yeah, and
there
it's
was
going
really
to
an
affect
urgency
it.
on that.
Misty, I hear the music coming, and we've got to close it out. Thank you for joining us, though. Conversation as always. Misty Winston, political activist, organizer, and co-host of both the Facts on the Ground podcast and Free Assange Vigils. You're listening to Fault Lines. We'll be right back.
Listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault Lines.
Live from across the divided states of America, it is time now for the last hour this morning of the most disruptive show covering news, politics, and events from across these disunited states we like to call America and from across the increasingly divided surface of our globe. In the independent corner, I'm your political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
And in the left corner, I am the indefatigable, the last man on the wall, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And together we are Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. All right. Again, the Taliban has taken over Afghanistan. America just lost its longest war. That's headline number one, but I'll be getting to that later on because we have a format with these things. And first up in that format are our COVID stats. Let's get into them. There were about 144,297 new COVID cases reported in the U.S. yesterday. Also, about 993 new deaths reported. Over the past week, there have been an average of about 139,872 cases per day. That's an increase of 52% from the average taken 2 weeks earlier. 51% of the total American population has been vaccinated at this point. 60% of the population has received at least one dose. And as of this morning, the coronavirus has infected 37,133,674 people. It's also killed 623,237 people. Both of those statistics are, of course, for the United States only. Newsweek is reporting that the head of the International Vaccine Institute is recommending that instead of moving immediately to booster shots for the already vaccinated, giving booster shots to people who already have COVID vaccines, we should instead be prioritizing fully vaccinating those parts of the world that are at an extremely low vaccination rate. I want to come back to this. Texas Governor Greg Abbott, who is leading the charge against mandating vaccines and masks with Governor DeSantis, has tested positive for COVID-19. Likely, Abbott got the virus from one of his standing room only events. Those are events designed with spacing opposite of social distancing. Abbott told the press he had received a third booster shot before this positive test. People are accusing him of lying about that, but like Jamarl says, this should be fairly easy to prove. I don't know.
Yeah.
You'd assume.
It looks like we would have a card.
Unless he got one of those weird black market saline booster shots that they don't want to stamp your card.
I don't know. It just seems like if you're a governor, it seems like a pretty big lie. Well, maybe not. I don't know. It just seems like it should be straightforward. The governor's schedule should be pretty clear. And the day that he went to get it was like, hey, Governor, when did you get your booster? That's straightforward. No.
Well, you have this entry marked 6 p.m. It says get shots. It's not what you're thinking. I don't know why that came to mind. In national news, House Democrats introduced a voting rights bill named for the late Congressman John Lewis, which would restore elements of the Voting Rights Act of 1965 and allow the federal government to block some changes to state election laws that it deems to be discriminatory. In international news, Afghanistan's youngest mayor on Sunday said she is waiting for the Taliban to come and kill her. That was reported at NBC News. Zarifa Ghaffari, 27-year-old, not just Afghanistan's youngest mayor, but one of its only women mayors. And again, this was this Sunday. The Taliban, in major press conferences as well as official releases, has said they are trying to protect the rights of women, whatever that means in the context of Sharia law.
Yeah.
That they
want to stay in government. They want women.
They want women in government. They want women in business. I remember I was listening to a questioning between a Taliban spokesperson and a woman reporter who was asking him, hey, I'm getting reports from women in the north of Afghanistan who are trying to get into university. Right. And what they're telling me is soldiers are not letting them in. Is this the Taliban policy that the soldiers Specifically, she said the women were telling her, the soldiers were saying, we're trying to figure this out or something like that. You can't enter right now, but soon enough you'll be able to enter, that kind of thing. The Taliban spokesperson said that's not our official policy. They're going to be,
Yeah, that's what I mean. I don't think
female,
they know
female
themselves.
education institutions. That's what this person said. That it's going to be gender split, which at least that's education. And that whoever's doing that is not acting under the name of the Taliban. But you were saying, they might not even know. In other words, there might be a lot of people who are doing this without the Taliban leadership asking them to. It might just be that.
Yeah, I mean, these guys are still hardliners. It's not like they're not that Taliban. They're still Taliban. Yeah. I think in a weird way, Fauci is coming to my mind for some reason. And maybe it's because this ideological thing that has to deal with the pragmatic politics of the environment that they're in. So yes, they're still Taliban. Yes, they're still ideological actors. By the same token, they have pragmatic realities they have to deal with. It could be that. And so from the standpoint of a nationwide policy about exo, they may not know. Like, they may still be figuring that stuff out.
Well, figuring out in the sense of, because they've said this is our policy, but not everybody is necessarily catching up. And what they also said was that people fighting in our name have been looting and that kind of thing. So that it seems like whether those people are fighting in their name or they're actual Taliban fighters who've just gone slightly off the reservation or whatever. They're still trying to figure that stuff out. But from Gareth's conversation and from everything that we've seen, what is extremely clear is they're trying to present a different face than we're used to to the Western world, Western media establishment, Western governments, in order to procure aid and some positive sentiment.
Because the image in my head is a Taliban fighter with a huge gun to a woman's head in the middle of a soccer stadium, and she's in a burqa on her knees.
Yes.
That's the image in my head.
That's what you're thinking.
And that's what I remember, from previous. And so, I mean, it needs to be a different. I'm not one of those people that think that it's like, even though, no, I don't want us there. No, I don't think we should have invaded. Yes, I think we could have did better. But I still have concerns, especially for the people who are going to be left, females. They're going to be left in that country in regards to what this is going to look like going forward. So, yes, the government prior was corrupt, is all get out. I mean, I was just reporting this, I was showing you over the break. Afghan ambassador in Tajikistan says Afghan Ashraf Ghani escaped with bags full of $169 million of U.S. dollars when Kabul was falling. This guy is
the former president.
Yeah, former president.
So I just want to pause on that because I was going to get to this too. Big headline, assuming this is true. Afghan ambassador to Tajikistan saying the former president who fled when Kabul fell, basically as it was falling, leaves the ship that he's supposed to be piloting, scurries out with the rats, brings $169 million USD with him. Yeah. That's, if 1/6 of a billion, that's a weird random fraction. But my point is, that's a lot of money. That's a lot of money. You could solve a lot of problems.
But see, I think that's indicative of the problems of Afghanistan and in general.
Yeah, totally.
I mean, when people are talking about
who are we supposed to blame for that? I'm sorry for...
No, but who wants to fight for that?
Blame him and blame us. Those are the only two people. Yeah. Who else are you literally supposed to blame for that? When we gave him the money and he took it, we knew... Shouldn't we have had some strings attached to it if that's the thing? Why did we give all this? Why, he procured it, he inevitably embezzled it, and that's the assumption, right?
Bag of cash, yeah. And it's like, who wants to fight that? It's that part.
Yeah.
And that's the part that people keep glossing over. Like, oh, they didn't fight for themselves. They didn't want to fight for themselves. The president absconded with nearly $200 million. Put it in context.
Yes.
I mean, and if you're looking at the corruption and everything else that was taking place, that seems to be just par for the course.
Yeah.
So.
All right, coming back to headlines briefly here, but continuing on with the conversation on Afghanistan. We were just talking about Ashraf Ghani. He was the most recent president. President before him, Mohammad Karzai, actually was party to meetings with this insurgent group, the Haqqani Network, which is basically an insurgent guerrilla group that's been around since the 80s, but has been pretty actively fighting NATO forces in Afghanistan for the last 15 years.
Yeah.
My point being, meeting between the former president, Mohammad Karzai, and this insurgent group, sort of an offshoot in some way related to the Taliban. The connection's slightly unclear, but my point is that's a sort of solidification of power. You're using not Ghani, the one who fled, but Karzai, the one who is in power for longer, the one who has more legitimacy. You're talking to him.
Yeah.
Who the Afghan people are like, okay, they see the parents having this conversation. It's a weird metaphor, but you get my point.
Yeah.
Okay, they're talking. That's a kind of big step, actually, from the Taliban's perspective.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah. It's the consolidation.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Biden has frozen billions of dollars in Afghan currency held in banks and reserves in the United States. The administration is using this as a tactic to limit cash flow to the Taliban. Currently, the Afghani, that's the Afghan currency, is at its lowest, all-time lowest value since its inception. The Taliban have set up checkpoints all over Kabul where residents' smartphones are being searched for evidence of communicating in English or affiliation with Western governments or organizations. One of the biggest checkpoints is stationed at Kabul's airport, severely increasing the difficulty of evacuating people there. For example, a German A400M Airbus with a capacity of 100 people departed from Kabul with only 7 passengers, so approximately 1/14 of the amount that it should have had on it. The head of the UN Refugee Agency said that refugees should not be sent back to Afghanistan following the Taliban takeover and that neighboring countries should begin creating escape routes for those wishing to flee the country. A top Taliban leader sat down with a female reporter yesterday for a live in-person interview with Tolo News. The act is to project a modern image from the new governing body of Afghanistan to the rest of the world. Many female reporters have reportedly been forced into hiding or are fleeing their homes. This move makes the future of the treatment of women in Afghanistan unclear. In tech news, T-Mobile has confirmed a massive data breach on their servers affecting roughly 47.8 million people. Data believed to have been stolen include people's first and last names, their date of birth, their social security number, and their driver's license/ID information. The culprit was selling this information of around 30 million people in exchange for $270,000 in Bitcoin. That's like less than a penny per person. They're putting a really low value on that data. It's true, man.
It's a sale. Yeah, man, that's horrible. And this is the, third time in 2 years?
Did we say that?
Is it 2 or 3 times?
Yes, the third attack the company has suffered within 2 years. Pardon me, the next part of the headline I was about to get to. Yes, the third attack the company has suffered within 2 years. In Earth and Science news, Jeff Bezos and Blue Origin are now suing NASA because of the Moonlander contract that the government agency awarded to SpaceX. The lawsuit challenges, I'm quoting here, challenges NASA's unlawful and improper evaluation of proposals submitted under the Human Landing System Option A broad agency announcement, end quote. Basically, they didn't follow protocols for deciding who to hand this contract to, so Blue Origin is suing them. The documents regarding the case are sealed to the public after Blue Origin was granted a protective order on Monday, earlier this week. And with that, those are our headlines. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. I want to go back, because you and I had a conversation about the whole, executing people in soccer stadiums thing. We talked about that briefly yesterday. And I had just been reading about Bachabazi and the thing we were talking about with Gareth Porter earlier, which is basically the Taliban coming to power, in part, on opposing that practice. Yeah. Whereby usually older men would molest, rape younger men, boys, to be clear, boys like 12-year-olds, 13-year-olds, that kind of thing. Sometimes older than that, too, though. And then sometimes, sometimes there were girls involved, but it seems like it was mostly men and boys. Anyway, Taliban came to power partly based on opposing this practice. They, in fact, would put people to death for being the culprits, being the people who committed this. So I'm thinking that's extremely severe, but also it's like better putting somebody to death for raping a kid than putting somebody to death for driving a car as a woman. Yeah. That kind of thing. Exactly. And so that's kind of my context going into the soccer stadium beheadings. Maybe they're not just, crimes for wearing cosmetics that you shouldn't be, or those kinds of I don't know what to call them exactly, but,
crimes of moral crimes.
I don't even,
in their minds.
I don't know, but just, humanitarian crimes or something like this. And it's not even crimes against humanity. People just trying to be people is the sense that I'm getting, but there's no real clear definition. My point is, that was sort of my impression, but I'm probably wrong, and they probably were punishing a lot of people who really didn't deserve it for doing the most basic things, like women trying to drive cars or not having to wear hijabs outside, that kind of thing.
Yeah, I tell you this, the women are freaked out. And like you said, they've started putting on the burqas and those type of things. Some of the Western female reporters have also started to cover up and everything else in response. But again, it's been somewhat bloodless, at least less than I maybe thought would have anticipated going into it. I think I would have thought the fall of Kabul would have been far more bloodier. They do seem to have taken somewhat of a different tact than what they were, or the very least the face that they're projecting outward. I suspect that there will be cases of, even under the best of circumstances, violence where, they go too far in saying, okay, we are isolated in this particular pocket of an area, and so we're going to be that much more brutal in this area to force religious tradition, et cetera, even though maybe from the larger part of things, they may be less so. I don't know. It's just, yes, and that's what makes it so weird to hear Mark is making this argument about Nazis versus Taliban. It's just feels such a weird thing, even though I know from the economist standpoint, it's just a matter of, numbers, dollars and cents, and which one you want most. And it's like, if this one is 0.2 more, then, you go in the direction of the 0.2 more. But no, I am, like I said before, I'm very curious about how this turns out. I am very curious about whether or not, because truth of the matter is, and I think we've said this before, there's always a social pressure on countries. Like, so if, whatever they start off as, from the standpoint of either internet, from the standpoint of neighbors, from the standpoint of modernity, et cetera, there's a social pressure. And, we make this thing, the arc of history is long, but it bends towards fairness. It's not that I think history bends. I think people try to fight for their rights, and over time they realize, I'm being disadvantaged. I'm being taken advantage of. And that friction itself makes it, from the perspective of things, looks as if it's moving in a direction. But I don't doubt Afghanistan wouldn't be any different from that in regards to this kind of push. I suspect it would probably be similar to Saudi Arabia in the way that people are pushing for their rights, and there are consequences for doing so, despite the fact they continue to do so. Or no different than the United States with African Americans pushing for rights despite Jim Crow and everything else. I think on some level we need to be willing to allow countries to have their growth arc without us immediately saying we need to drop humanitarian bombs to do so.
Yeah.
And that doesn't seem to be the case. Like the good war, Howard Zinn made this argument that, just because not every good reason demands a good war. And he was making this case of, hitting the main wars, like the First War, Second War, and the Revolutionary War. And he was trying to make the argument basically saying, okay, these are the wars that are considered sacrosanct in American history in regards to their credibility and their standing. And not shirking away from, quote unquote bad wars, but hitting those directly, making the point that just because something has a reason doesn't necessarily mandate a war. And oddly enough, it should go without saying, but in this country, we make those connections immediately. So something happens on 9/11. We need a war. Like, well, wait a minute. Is there a way to do this without a war? Nope, not at all. And it doesn't really matter what that is, whether it's invading many of the other countries or anything else. Not every good reason necessitates a good war. And sometimes there are ways of going about things other than doing so. Barbara Lee. And, Barbara Lee was one of those only people who stood up before Congress and gave that speech about basically saying, counseling caution. This is not something that we want to do off the top of our heads in the way that we're going to do this in this kind of hot-headed fashion, and we're going to regret it. And Barbara Lee ended up being right. Even though I don't know how, it's like, how do you stand in the middle of a train like that at the point where a country is hit? And
she's the one person to whom we must give credit at the time, though, right? In Congress. And we're going to be talking about her in just a minute with Joel Siegel.
Yeah, exactly.
Coming back on that, you're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, coming back talking with Joel Siegel, former congressional staffer, co-author of H.R. 676. That's the expanded and improved Medicare for All bill. One of the leading architects for passage of the Affordable Care Act, a.k.a. Obamacare. Also, one of the most controversial guests on our show, I would say. We'll get into that in a minute with Joel. When we come back, you're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Be right back.
Fault Lines. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We give you the most essential information out there. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
When the going gets tough, the powerful want propaganda. But we won't let them cancel the facts. Whether you're woke or drowsy, we know that you can handle the truth, and we're giving it to you every morning. Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan every Monday through Friday from 7 to 10 a.m. Eastern. Your first stop for sanity in a world gone mad.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined with my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. If you guys live in the area, you can catch us on radio at 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. We're also in Kansas City at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. If you guys are digging what Shane and I are putting down, whatever platform you're consuming this content on, give us a like and share that audio or video. If you want to join in on the conversation, you can do so with a chat, a tweet, and of course, you can reach us by phone at 202-521-1320. That is 202-521-1320. Your engagement helps make this show what it is, so definitely don't be shy. We've been dedicating right much attention to basically the collapse in Afghanistan of American forces and the taking of Afghanistan by the Taliban. During the run-up to the wars that took place after 9/11, the country was on a war footing. Somebody, in the way that I think Scott put it, bodies needed to be stacked. Somebody hit us. We're a superpower, and we need to get revenge on the people who hit us. Now, we chose Afghanistan. We chose Iraq. Two countries that, if we're being entirely honest, were not entirely the culprits in the whole situation, and yet those were the countries that ended up taking the hit to the tune of hundreds of thousands of lives and trillions of dollars. One of the people during Congress, or at the time in Congress, that basically stood up and counseled caution was Barbara Lee. And Barbara Lee deserves a ton of credit for being able to do that, looking a country in the eye that has just been hit and still cautioning action or belligerent action. To have a conversation about this, we're joined with Joel Siegel. Joel Siegel is former congressional staffer and co-author of H.R. 676, the Expanded and Improved Medicare for All bill, and one of the leading architects for the passage of the Affordable Care Act. He's co-founder and national director of the Justice Action Mobilization Network, a nationwide multiracial climate action network. Joel, thank you for joining us.
Hey, it's great to be here. I love the programming of your radio station, because there's no one else in media that would ever bring up Barbara Lee's speech. I was there when it happened, and I'm glad to be part of this.
Exactly, and that's why I was thinking about you this morning, because that speech was profound. I mean, like it's really hard to get across to people. 9/11 happened. We had just been hit. 3,000 Americans' lives lost. And from the media standpoint, the media doesn't really recount things that we were doing abroad. It doesn't recount the governments that we were knocking over and stuff like that. We have very straightforward blinders on in regards to what the American public is indoctrinated with. And so the idea that we were hit, it seemed like, oh, they just hit us because of our freedoms. That nonsense. And so you get this kind of weird situation where a country that has just been hit, that is on a war footing, and Barbara Lee makes a speech counseling caution. Profound and not easy, courageous. And like you say, you were there. So can you explain what was taking place on Capitol Hill at the time of this speech? And not just that, the courage that it took, meaning the pressure that was on her. And yet she still chose to do what she considered to be the right thing.
Yeah, so I'll give you the context. I was in the building, the Rayburn building, when 9/11 went down, and I remember the building shook, and I looked out the window, and I saw smoke coming from the Pentagon, and then the bomb went off, and everyone was rushed out of the Rayburn building because they said a plane is coming. And I remember I rushed out with Representative Hilda Solis. I've never been through anything like that in my life. You know, we thought that our lives were in danger, that a plane was going to come and, smash in the building, kill us all. So there was this, I would say I'd call it a Pearl Harbor fear. You know, we've been attacked, and because we were attacked by Al-Qaeda, then we must attack them. It was a reflexive, like a Pearl Harbor reflexive kind of a feeling from I would say across the board. There was dissension about Iraq, by the way. And I remember I went into Mr. Conner's office and I talked to him about, impeachment. And he'd been talking about impeachment for a long time and had a long meeting with a lot of Clinton, senior advisors. And I recanted later. That's another story. But I was walking down the hall to meet with another member of Congress, and Barbara Lee had just taken the vote. She was on her cell phone, and her face was ashen. She looked like her best friend had just died, and it was that traumatic even for her to take that vote. And I had just watched her make the speech and she was crying and she was trembling. It was an amazing act of courage. I've never seen a member do that before. So she did go against the grain, and one of the things that Jeffrey Sachs, the great economist Jeffrey Sachs, is talking about is you can't do regime change for the United States, whether it was the CIA who did, illegal hits and assassinations of different, elected presidents in Latin America. But regime change, according to Sachs, it does not work. So this is a very, very important issue because there are lessons, to be learned.
Okay, so yeah, I mean, it was a phenomenal speech. I'm sorry, we're pulling a part of the speech. I think we're going to play a little bit of the speech. But in regards to the context of it, so when you said she made her vote, she was shaking when she made that vote. Did you have the opportunity to talk to her or anybody on her staff at the time that this was taking place?
No, when I saw it, normally, oftentimes I would talk to the progressive members of Congress because, the staff do so much work on the Hill. It's, I made very good relationships with most members of Congress that were progressive, and so I used to talk to her, pretty regularly. But the vibe and energy was, let me leave her alone. And she was on the phone, but yeah, she was clearly shaken because she knew that she was the lone vote. I mean, she was it. And talk about an act of courage. She got a lot of flack, by the way, from that one vote. And but it was interesting. It kind of came and then it left. We invaded Afghanistan, and the perspective back then was we have to invade Afghanistan, take out Al Qaeda because the Taliban, that was a safe haven for terrorist training. Therefore, we've got to invade. And there really was not a conversation about whether or not to invade. It's like, we have to invade. We got hit by the Japanese. And, the question becomes, and it's really an important question, the thousands of lives that were, taken in Afghanistan, both the civilians and our soldiers, was it worth it? And it is very important to have this discussion. I'm so glad that, I'm honored to be on this show, because if it happens again, then are we going to rush to judgment, and rush to action, the opposite of what Barbara Lee counseled us, and make the same mistake? And my gut feeling is that, yes, we will make the same mistake. And now there are a lot of people who do not feel that it was a mistake. They felt like what we did in Afghanistan was the right thing to do. I beg to differ. I mean, a lot of the roots of terrorism, there's plenty of books written about this. It is abject poverty, lack of hope, lack of housing, infrastructure, food, corrupt government. The Marshall Plan worked in World War II in Japan and Germany to help stabilize those governments. We didn't go in there and impose a government. We supported their governments by giving them billions of dollars of aid so they could create a middle class and create jobs, because the elected officials at that time knew that Germany and Japan could easily go back to being fascist if they, had a ravaged economy. We never thought through Afghanistan like that. That's what Jeffrey Sachs was saying in his wonderful article. You can't nation build, just by bombing it. You got to think it through. A lot of the Taliban are very impoverished people, where you have Taliban commanders who will say, all right, we're going to give you an AK-47. We want you to blow up this American base, and we're going to give your family food for a year. And that's what happens. And we got to have a sophisticated, no finger pointing. We got to have a real conversation about this. And it's got to be national. It's got to be in the media, or the same thing's going to happen again.
I don't see us having that conversation anytime soon. The media is hitting Biden left and right for withdrawing. I saw an article on the Atlantic talking about something like the burden of shame that Biden has to carry on his shoulders for leaving the women in Afghanistan to deal with this plight. And admittedly, they're dealing with the plight. But my point being, the media is going to hit him on this. They're not going to hit him on other things that they probably should be. And in my opinion, they're hitting him on one of the things that they shouldn't be. Specifically pulling out. The way that we pulled out was egregious, but the decision to pull out was just, in my opinion. My point being, that's like where they've demonstrated that they are on this one. I don't see any sign that they're going to change. Military establishment in general They're just going to do what they always have done. So, well, first of all, Joel, do you agree with me? Are you a little bit more optimistic? Do you think things will change, or do you think that the status quo is just going to persist?
John, I think you're right. I think that the status quo could persist, and I think your perspective is absolutely correct. I do think it was egregious. I think the withdrawal was precipitous. It wasn't well planned out. A lot of these translators who are going to get executed by the Taliban. I mean, if they execute soldiers who peacefully say, I surrender, and then they execute them, they will execute the people who they feel like were enemies of the Taliban. And I wish they had really been more thoughtful in terms of the evacuation of Afghanis who were supportive of our troops. Whether one agrees or disagrees with, should we have gone in, yes or no, the morality and the ethics are they should have gotten those Afghanis out. I think the only way that there could be a conversation about this is if, progressives figure out a way to, make that happen, because change is always made by people who are, not a lot of people, but people who are very passionate and committed, and they challenge the status quo thinking. And that's how change is made. I mean, the Congress didn't want to do Medicare for all. They didn't even want to do the Affordable Care Act, but our movement made them do it. And similarly, you got to do that, with foreign policy. So it's up to the grassroots to make sure that we have that discussion. I mean, clearly, you've got all these universities and academics that if there's going to be a conversation about when do we go to war, it's going to have to come, I think, from the universities, and that includes community colleges, right? And that's where it needs to happen. And so it wouldn't be that difficult for a professor calling another professor that works in foreign policy, doing a series of symposiums live so people can watch it, but not one. It has to be ongoing.
Well, I mean, I've got a lot of stuff to say on that, but we also have this clip of Barbara Lee. And so I don't want to get too off on a tangent without going into the thing that we were talking about. But I disagree with you on some stuff there. I agree on other parts. But let's play this clip. We're talking with Joel Siegel, former congressional staffer, longtime activist. We're talking about Barbara Lee's speech against going to war with Afghanistan back in late 2001, of course, following 9/11, and ultimately the decision to invade. And Joel telling us personally, giving some testimony, she was crying, her face ashen-faced, I think was the phrase that you used. Anyway, we're talking about her speech. Let's listen to a part of it. This is Barbara Lee, Congresswoman Barbara Lee, speaking, protesting the decision to declare war on Afghanistan. Let's play this clip, Andre.
Gentlewoman from California is recognized for a minute and a half.
Thank you, and I want to thank our ranking member and my friend for yielding. Mr. Speaker, members, I rise today really with a very heavy heart, one that is filled with sorrow for the families and the loved ones who were killed and injured this week. Only the most foolish and the most callous would not understand the grief that has really gripped our people and millions across the world. This unspeakable act on the United States has really forced me, however, to rely on my moral compass, my conscience, and my God for direction. September 11th changed the world. Our deepest fears now haunt us. Yet I am convinced that military action will not prevent further acts of international terrorism against the United States. This is a very complex and complicated matter. Now, this resolution will pass, although we all know that the president can wage a war even without it. However difficult this vote may be, some of us must urge the use of restraint. Our country is in a state of mourning. Some of us must say, let's step back for a moment. Let's just pause just for a minute and think through the implications of our actions today so that this does not spiral out of control. Now, I have agonized over this vote, but I came to grips with it today, and I came to grips with opposing this resolution during the very painful yet very beautiful memorial service. As a member of the clergy so eloquently said, as we act, let us not become the evil that we deplore. Thank you, and I yield the balance of my time.
Gentlewoman's time has expired.
And that's Barbara Lee. And that makes me forget everything that we were going to be arguing about, Joel. She was incredibly brave there. You can hear it in her voice. She's getting up there, and you can hear the trepidation. She's not just sad. She's speaking amongst all of her colleagues, amongst her class, and she's saying something that they're going to unanimously disagree with. Mm-hmm. She's being very brave there, and you can hear the fear, frankly, when you're listening to her. But she's saying honest words. Joel, what are your thoughts?
I mean, what she was saying was, before we invade, let's think this through. And she was correct. Let's think it through. And, when any member of Congress that's thoughtful, and she comes from the Bay Area, which is, absolutely anti-war, but, I know Barbara Lee, and I know her staff, and I knew Ron Dellums very well, and she was his chief of staff. She was just being, very thoughtful. She didn't say, don't invade. She just said, before we take any action, let's think this through. And, I've always loved working with her because she was always willing to take a stand on principle. And in the, 13 years I worked with her, and probably about maybe, 20 altogether, she's never wavered on principle. She's a phenomenal member of Congress.
What was Conyers' take on this, by the way? I mean, like you said, you were in Congress during the time that this was taking place. What was his perspective on all of this?
You know what? It's interesting because whenever a member of Congress votes, the first thing that happens is the staff vote for the members of Congress, by the way. We have a vote sheet. And then we give our recommendation to the member of Congress, and then the member of Congress makes their own decision. And I can't remember having any conversations with him, about this, because my relationship was based on, universal health care and, domestic stuff in Detroit. But he definitely was vociferously opposed to the invasion of Iraq. I can tell you that. In terms of Afghanistan, I never heard him say really what his, position was. I founded the Out of Iraq Caucus through the Progressive Caucus and brought in Ralph Nader and all kinds of folks to start hearings and briefings because I thought it was a ridiculous war. I couldn't stand what happened with the torture in Abu Ghraib. And but with I would say at the time in Afghanistan, there was a consensus even among the Black Caucus and Progressive Caucus that this was an exception, that we were attacked and we had to get the perpetrators, by any means necessary. But what was, interesting, bin Laden was not in Afghanistan. Bin Laden was in Pakistan. And I think the theory was, well, we have to go into Afghanistan in order to get bin Laden. But that's not quite what happened. Afghanistan was harboring, terrorists and allowing them safe haven, to plan attacks. And that's why that was the logic. We can't allow any nation to harbor terrorists that are going to then attack us. And 9/11 was absolutely horrific. We all watched, burning buildings and people jumping out of buildings, and it was horrible. And I think that's what colored everyone's, foreign policy decisions about Afghanistan.
The thing is, though, that much of the planning took place in the U.S., in Germany, yes, maybe some in Afghanistan. I guess it was so. I don't know how they were able to disambiguate one versus the other in regards to this is the country that's going to take the hit as opposed to one of the other countries. The conversations were the briefings and everything else. I would imagine that the various staffs was going to be briefed. How did that work? What were the mechanics of, I would say, the dissemination of information to the various members of Congress to make that choice and to make that vote on Afghanistan?
That's a very, very good question. Usually the House Foreign Relations Committee would get, there'd be probably communication, from the White House. And, the Department of Defense would advise the president, and then the president they meet with the CIA and the national security apparatus, and then they determine what they think is the best course of action, unlike what happened in Iraq, which was a lie, and everybody knew it was a lie, right? In Iraq, the foreign policy establishment said there were weapons of mass destruction in there, and there was the possibility of nuclear, nuclear fuel, right, to make nuclear weapons. None of that turned out to be true, and they knew it wasn't true. They knew. And nevertheless, with Afghanistan, there was just the sense of we got to hit them back because they're going to do it again. That was the one thing I heard. If we don't stop them, if we don't stop al-Qaeda in Afghanistan, they will plan another attack and they will hit us again. That was the feeling. So it was Pearl Harbor syndrome.
I think worth understanding now in retrospect, mostly as a cautionary tale for not getting it wrong again in the future. In other words, I don't place too much, hindsight is 20/20, sure, but I would like to think that I opposed this war at the time. Admittedly, I was like 9 years old. 9 years old. Yeah. I was practically an infant when it came to political stuff. My point being, I get what you're saying. You're trying to get back into the mindset of where people were at the time, but clearly that was the wrong place to be. And I can't help but think that they were swayed into doing this. That if the leadership had been better, if it had been another version of Bush or somebody other than Bush, that there would have been a more proportionate way to respond to this that would have actually solved it. Because as it was, it took another decade to kill bin Laden. We spread terror across the whole Middle East. I mean, the being hoisted by our own petard, those aspects are all obvious and already very well discussed, by outlets like us. So I don't need to get too deep into it. But my point is, those outlooks at that time were wrong. They were the wrong frame of reference to be using, because if you look at what they caused, it didn't work. It didn't lead to anything good. It led to a lot more disaster. Now, this gets very interesting for me now because of the media. We've only got a couple minutes with you, Joel, but I want to pivot to this. We've been talking about this. Media is hitting Biden on this. Like I said earlier, I saw a story just this morning from The Atlantic about how the burden of shame has fallen on Biden's shoulders. The problems with our withdrawal here, The Atlantic says, or at least this op-ed said, are all Biden's. All these problems are caused by Biden. Now, Atlantic, left-leaning establishment sort of outlet, representative, I think, of where MSNBC, CNN, all these other outlets are falling on this one. They do not like the nature of this withdrawal, and they're hitting Biden on it. And in a way, it reminds me of Biden's talks with Putin in Geneva a little while back. I think it was Jamarl who brought this up, that those are a couple instances where he's trying to be a bit more conciliatory. Biden, I'm speaking of, a bit more conciliatory, pulling out of wars, doing that kind of thing. The media hits him on that after hitting him on basically nothing else. Then with Trump, turn to Trump for a second. Where does the media start to like Trump? I'm not just talking Fox, I'm talking MSNBC, CNN. It's when he bombs Syria. It's when he escalates. So for people who have listened to me say this a couple times, it's probably getting boring. But my point is, the bias is extremely obvious there. Do you see that too, Joel? Do you see the bias? And if so, what do you think about it?
When you say bias, you mean more bias against Biden, or there was more bias?
It's not even Trump versus Biden so much as it is pro-war. Whatever either one does, when Trump does things to make war more likely or to make military industrial contractors more money, like rocketing Syria, he gets plaudits. The media likes it. When Biden pulls back, media doesn't like it. Now, there are problems with this, and maybe you can make the case that there were problems with Biden's meeting with Putin, but really, it's just the direction that they're moving in. If somebody's moving towards war, they get praise. If somebody moves away from war, they get criticized. Do you not see that, Joel?
No, that's a very good point. I mean, let's say you're a reporter for MSNBC or CNN. You're on the ground and you're watching, hundreds, if not thousands of people trying to get on a transport plane, and they're holding onto the fuselage and they're falling from the sky. And you see the Taliban are now whipping people. They're whipping women if their veils aren't completely covered. And they're hearing gunshots. They're seeing, complete pandemonium of which they've never seen before. Then the predilection is going to be to blame President Biden because, as Biden said, the buck stops with me. I take full responsibility for everybody. And the one thing where I do love America, I know a lot of people have problems with America. America's not perfect, but I do like the fact that, unlike China and other countries, we at least have a free media that is. I'm not saying I'm a progressive. I wish the media was more progressive, but we do have your station, for example. They're being very emotional, and they're they're hurting inside as human beings, and they're like, hey, this withdrawal wasn't done right. And whether one likes Biden or doesn't like Biden, it's about policy. I might be a progressive Democrat, and I think Biden is, he's doing a pretty good job. I wish he'd do more on Medicare for all or expanding health insurance to everybody in the next 100 days. But, Johnson had to be criticized on his war in Vietnam, right? And when a president makes a mistake, it is important to point it out in the press so they don't make it again. But that's the beauty of the First Amendment. In terms of bias, I wouldn't be able to really answer that, but I do.
I don't know. I see it pretty clearly. I think it's worth hitting Biden on this one. I mean, and yes, on the one, I'm in a weird position because yes, I agree. It is worth hitting Biden on the absolute travesty that was this departure and the, fraught position that we're putting a lot of our translators and embassy staff and diplomatic personnel and friends, people who are supposed to be working with us that we think of as friends, or at least talk of as friends. We're putting a lot of those people in danger. So that's very palpable. But again, this is also an intel failure. This is a planning failure. And it seems to me the deeper point, which I think you just disagree on, that Biden is mostly getting flack for this because of the kind of thing it is, because he's pulling out of this country, not just because it was a failure. Because we've had all sorts of, I'll put it like this, our immigration response, but the Biden administration's response to the ongoing immigration crisis is also an extravagant, obvious failure that they could be hitting him on constantly. And yet, why are they hitting him on this? It's not just because it's flashy. They're making it flashy. It's because it's because it's pulling out of a war, right? I mean, you've already said your piece, Joel. I don't mean to belabor the point.
No, that's okay. I mean, I think that Trump's handling of immigration was by far much worse. One of the most immoral, disgusting travesties I've ever seen in my life, and that was whipping, children from families. I mean, that, and say, well, we want this to be a deterrent so, their parents don't come. Compared to what Biden is doing, at least he's, going about enforcing laws. I think the right wings, not you, but the right wings, narrative of Trump, Biden is just completely insane. The free borders and open borders. No, it's not. That's not true. In terms of this situation, one of the things that Biden administration officials keep saying is they did not anticipate the Taliban, taking over these cities as quickly as they did. Well, I beg to differ. I mean, they took over city after city after city after town.
Yeah.
The military did not put up a fight. They surrendered. So I don't buy that argument. But there might be a grain of truth in it. Maybe they did not think that they would reach the capital of Afghanistan, but they were advancing quite rapidly.
They were. I remember late last week, the position that we were in, I thought, was basically, hey, the Taliban can take Kabul whenever they want to, but surely they'll wait for NATO forces to withdraw, right? And then, within a day or two, no, they did not wait for NATO forces to withdraw. So we'll close it out here. Interesting conversation. And it was good to talk with you about Barbara Lee. And this is, part of why we like talking is you have inside knowledge. You were there for a lot of this stuff. And I was joking. I introed you before we came into your segment. You're one of our most controversial guests, and you are. I think it's like this, there's this narcissism of small differences thing. I'm not saying this is all of it, but I think a lot of people are very close to you in progressive policies, but they're like deeply, deeply anti-establishment. And the fact that you work with the establishment and you like Nancy Pelosi, or at least can get along with her, really, really pisses people off because they see, I think you can imagine it gets kind of controversial, but nevertheless, we like talking with you. Joel Siegel, thank you for joining us this morning.
Yeah, thank you. I don't agree with everything that Pelosi does, but when I do see something positive, I'm going to say it. I'm not pro or anti-establishment. I'm about reforming what I think is morally and ethically wrong. That's what I'm about.
And fair enough. And that is a very clear ethical position. And I think one probably a lot more people could do to pay attention to and learn from. Joel, thank you for joining us this morning. We got to close. Really appreciate it. Joel Siegel is a former congressional staffer, co-author of H.R. 676. That's the expanded and improved Medicare for All bill. And he's one of the leading architects for passage of the Affordable Care Act, a.k.a. Obamacare. He's co-founder and national director of the Justice Action Mobilization Network. That's JAM, a nationwide multiracial climate action network. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Coming back, we're taking your calls, 202-521-1320. Get in on this line while there's still time for it. 202-521-1320 is the number. We'll be right back.
lines. Radio Sputnik. We speak your language. Find us at SputnikNews.com.
Are you bored? Are you lonely? Do you need a hug? Well, we can't give you that, but we can keep you up to date on Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, and we're taking your calls. 202-521-1320. Again, that's 202-521-1320. Let's go to Tarif calling in from New Orleans. Tarif, you're on the line. What's on your mind?
How y'all doing? I have three comments. My last comment is I need time to explain. It ain't going to take that long. Okay, first I'd like to say free Jordan Science, free Danger, hands off Haiti. Jamarl Thomas came out with an article on a Wall Street Journal talking about she is dangerous to the Chinese state. And she is dangerous to the Chinese state, and also the Washington Examiner opinion piece said something about Taiwan must go nuclear. Now, since the current senator brought up article yesterday, he tweeted out something dealing with Taiwan having 30,000 troops in their state. What happened is now the Chinese is upset. They want to be convinced that it's not. So, because if it is 30,000 American troops in Taiwan, then they will declare war and they will kick out the U.S. troops. That means that now that 7,000 troops in Afghanistan can be, the communications can be just jammed and they can be wound up trapped in that state now. So because we're in a real dangerous time, so we just got to pray for our troops and make sure everyone all of them come home. I shared those three links with y'all where Senator John Cornyn had posted up that they had 30,000 troops in Taiwan. China think that's an invasion. So just hope and pray that nothing comes of it. That's all I want to say.
Well, and then I'm seeing fact checks here where specifically CNN is saying that John Cornyn falsely claimed that there are 30,000 U.S. troops. I don't know. The article that you sent over, which I did see before you called it, and thank you for the call, Tarif, I didn't like, and this was from Sputnik actually, I didn't like how the article was titled. It says something like U.S. declares war on China. It was kind of hyperbolic. They're quoting an expert who's saying this, but still. And I clicked into it and it had been taken down. He did say this. Yeah. But it's also being fact checked that there aren't 30,000, that his claim is wrong. And then I also would question, if there were, would that really be cause for China to declare war? Like, unless
they did with 30,000 troops in Taiwan.
If we had just moved 30,000 troops into there, if we're like actively moving a lot of troops, then maybe yes, because they're like, wait, why are you guys moving all of these troops into our claimed territory right on our borders? Why are you doing that? You know, are you going to invade us? But that's not what I see happening.
Yeah. And if they were, any country would take issue with that. What would the U.S. do if a foreign power was putting a bunch of troops at our border? But like you said, it's not true. So it's somewhat of a moot point.
Totally. We got other calls and we're taking more. 202-521-1320 is the phone number. Michael calling in from Sydney. Michael, you're on the line. What's on your mind?
Yeah, hey guys. First of all, I just want to say, just on that subject, Tyree was talking about, or something I was going to talk about. If America can't defeat the Taliban, if we can't defeat Iraq, if we can't even defeat, it hasn't won a war basically since the Second World War. I mean, you say defeat the Sandinistas or maybe Grenada, maybe you say they defeated those two countries or those two regimes, as America likes to call them. How are they going to defeat a near-peer adversary, or actually a peer adversary in a lot of ways, and in some ways superior adversaries such as China, Russia, and even Iran? I think it's a pipe dream. You can't defeat a bunch of tribesmen with AK-47s. Secondly, I'd like to say, what's not really talked about in Afghanistan, the country, the real player, the move of the shaker, everyone should watch, is actually Pakistan. They control the Taliban. Bin Laden was found in Pakistan. Everyone remembers that back in 2009. He was actually found in in Pakistan, hiding in a military training camp, actually. It was run by ISI, which is the Pakistani Intelligence Service. So if you want to know what's going on in Afghanistan, you should really look at Pakistan. I saw an interesting interview on RT today on going underground with the former United Nations Pakistani permanent representative to the UN, who was talking about this issue. The Pashtun tribes cross over the border between Pakistan and Afghanistan. The Pashtuns have a large influence through Baluchistan, which is particularly where the Chinese One Belt One Road is running through to the port of Gwaida, which is basically opening up the Gulf of Oman and Pakistan to oil trade, and Iran.
Well, and the oil trade, I want to come in here real quick, Michael. You're making a lot of good points, but one thing, oil trade, there's this pipeline running through Afghanistan, through Pakistan, through India that ties these nations together and introduces an interesting economic complexity that I wonder how it would affect, strategies and their movements. But also the Pashtun. The Pashtun population, this is just the most basic statistics. Taliban is clearly a religious Pashtun organization. Pakistan, what's the Pashtun population in Pakistan? Over 43 million. What's the Pashtun population in Afghanistan? Over 15 million. In other words, there are more Pashtun in Pakistan than there are in Afghanistan. I think you see where I'm going. There's going to be some connection and some strength there. Michael, I just wanted to add those in. What else did you have to say?
Yeah, well, that's basically on that subject. And I did want to mention something else. I'll shoot onto it. But it seems to elude me at the moment. So I'll just leave it there. You might have another call. I think maybe you have Brave or something, so I'll leave some space for him.
All right. 202-521-1320.
Yes.
Lines are open and Brave if you want to call in at Michael's invitation and ours too. Feel free. 202-521-1320.
Well, yeah, he usually thought like a minute before. It's like, all right, 1 minute to go, 30 seconds. But yeah, I mean, a really interesting show today. Joel, I am really, the behind the scenes stuff always fascinates me just because it's like, what are people, it's one thing when you see people give the speeches, or it's one thing if you see people and they're kind of going about their way. It's another thing to hear. It's like, okay, this is the stuff that was going on behind the scenes. It's like during Obama's tenure, I think when he was running against Romney, one of the books came out for the election. They were calling, I think it's called Center Holes or something. But it was talking about like the behind the scenes stuff that was taking place throughout the course of the election as it was going on, like the behind the scenes, the plans, the plotting, the strategy. Same thing with the stuff. I love that stuff. It gives you this take that you don't necessarily get to see. Barbara Lee is a person. And you'd imagine as a person, especially if she's thoughtful. Look, I'll put it this way. There are times, depending on who it is, I don't really care about the criticism, right? It's like there's some people who I feel better about myself because they criticize me, if that makes sense. It's like, yes, I'm a much better person now that this person is against me. I feel better about myself because that person disagrees. There are a few people who that's not true for. I would imagine Barbara Lee, if she's being thoughtful and everything else, she knows that her constituency, she knows what's just happened to the country. She knows this kind of bloodlust that's there. And, in this kind of difficult human way, believes that her moral obligation is greater. It's very interesting. And, like he makes the point, she was the lone vote to make that point. And it wasn't so much, let's not do this. It was more so, we really need to think about this and consider what we're trying to accomplish in pursuit of this. That is rare. That is rare, which is why I wanted to kind of flag it, especially now in the context of everything else when we're looking back over and we're looking for like a retrospective.
It's extraordinarily rare. Yeah, that's why we played it. And you can hear she's kind of afraid. At least that's what I heard in her voice. Like it, yeah. She sounds kind of afraid. Yeah, she's not just emotional, but clearly she's like stuttering a little bit on her words, and you can hear she's kind of catching her breath at little points because she's like a little bit out of breath because she's kind of panicked.
It's a dangerous position.
Because she's standing up to everybody that she works with.
Yeah. I mean, she knows she's a lone vote.
Yeah.
I mean, so it's like she knows. I mean, imagine her constituencies. Imagine her political opponents saying, oh, she was against this war, meaning she put herself out there. I'll put it that way.
Yeah. Let's close it out.
Yeah.
I suppose. We're getting pretty close to it at least. You guys have been listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. I want to thank all of our guests. I want to thank all of our callers. I want to thank our producers. I want to thank our engineer, Andre. And I want to thank you. That is you for listening to this morning's show. We'll be back tomorrow morning at 7 a.m. Eastern, folks. Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan signing off. See you on the other side.